Welcome back to Cosmic Wand. Today's adventure. Harry found a chamber where one night lasted 1,000 years and walked out unbeatable at age 11. Before we begin, do smash that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a story. Now let's begin. Chapter 1, The Arithmetic of Small Spaces. Number 4, Privet Drive ran on a fixed budget of attention, and Harry Potter had worked out early that the budget did not include him. This was useful information, and he had decided to treat it as such. Most people in his experience treated the discovery that the world overlooked them as an injury. Harry treated it as a map. A boy nobody watched could measure things. He could count the seconds it took Aunt Petunia to look up from the stove when a pan started to smoke, and learn that her attention had a delay of roughly 4 seconds and a maximum range of 1 room. He could note that Uncle Vernon's voice climbed half a register every time the word abnormal approached his lips, which gave a person ample warning to be elsewhere. He could observe that Dudley hit hardest when an audience was present and barely at all when alone, which told you that the fists were not really about Harry. None of it was kindness, all of it was data. He lived in the cupboard under the stairs, and the cupboard had taught him geometry. 4 feet by 3 if you were generous about where the slope of the stair cut the ceiling. A boy could lie diagonally and gain 6 inches. A boy could learn to fold a thin blanket into a mattress with exactly 2 folds, because 3 made it lumpy and 1 made it cold, and the difference between cold and lumpy was the kind of thing you only learned by spending 8 years getting it wrong. Small spaces required precise accounting. You could not afford to waste a single cubic inch, and so you learned to value inches in a way that people with whole rooms never did. That was the first arithmetic. There would, in time, be others. He was 10 years old, going on 11, and he was thin in the way that suggested a long argument with the dinner table that he had mostly lost. He had black hair that no comb had ever defeated and green eyes behind glasses held together at one corner with a knot of cellophane tape, and on his forehead under the hair, a scar shaped like a stroke of lightning that he had stopped asking about because the answers were always lies, and a person could learn more from the shape of a lie than from a refused truth. Petunia, asked once, had said the scar came from the car crash that killed his parents. Her hand had moved to her own throat when she said it, the way a person guards a thing rather than touches it. A car crash does not leave a clean geometric figure. Harry had been 6 when he understood that the story was load-bearing for some structure he could not yet see, and that the polite thing, the survivable thing, was to let it bear its load and say nothing. He did not believe in magic. He had simply assembled, over the years, a private collection of events that the available physics did not cover. The time a teacher's wig had turned blue. The time he had wanted very badly to be away from Dudley's gang and had found himself, between one blink and the next, on the roof of the school kitchens, with no memory of the climb and no plausible route up. The way his hair grew back overnight after Petunia, in a temper, had sheared it to the scalp. He kept these the way another child might keep marbles, in a drawer in his mind he visited rarely and never showed. The world had a story about itself, and Harry's collection contradicted the story, and a smart person did not stake his survival on contradicting the world before he understood the rules of the contradiction. So he waited. Patience, he had found, was the one resource the cupboard could not ration. The morning the first letter came, Harry was thinking about the dishwasher. Specifically, he was thinking that Petunia loaded it wrong, that she put the large plates in the small slots where they blocked the spray arm, and that if she would only reverse the 2 rows the glasses would stop coming out with a film on them, and that he would never, ever tell her this, because being right out loud at number 4 was a tax you paid and dinners missed. He was thinking about the mechanics of the spray arm when Dudley came thundering down the hall, having been sent to fetch the post, and stopped, and there was a silence of a particular quality, the quality of a thing happening that the budget had not planned for. "There's one for Harry," Dudley said in the tone of a boy reporting a crime. Harry was not in the normal run of things sent anything. The list of people who knew he existed and possessed both his address and a stamp was empty. He came out of the kitchen, drying his hands on the seat of his trousers, and looked at the envelope in Dudley's fat fingers and read, in green ink, in a script that belonged to no machine, his own name and an address that was wrong in a way that was somehow more correct than anything had ever been. Mr. H. Potter, the cupboard under the stairs, 4 Privet Drive, Little Winging, Surrey. Someone knew where he slept. That was the thought that arrived first, ahead of curiosity, ahead of everything. Someone somewhere had looked at the whole house and written down not the house but the cupboard. The address was not a guess. It was a statement. "We see you specifically in the smallest part of this place." He had spent his whole life being the unobserved variable, and here was a letter that had observed him with precision. He never got to open it. Vernon took it the way a man takes a live wire away from a child, by the corner fast, holding it at arm's length, and the morning came apart from there. Harry watched the next 11 days the way he watched everything, which was carefully, and what he learned was that the letter terrified his uncle in a manner entirely out of proportion to a piece of paper. A bill frightened Vernon. A neighbor's opinion frightened Vernon. This was a different animal. This was the fear of a man who has spent decades pretending a door does not exist and has just heard from the far side of it a knock. Vernon burned the letter. The next day two arrived. He nailed the mail slot shut. They came through the gaps under the door, folded into the dozen eggs, rolled inside the morning paper, a tide of green ink rising against the dam of his denial. Harry, forbidden to touch any of them, did the most useful thing available, which was to count. 12 on Thursday, 24 on Friday. On Sunday, when no post was delivered, they came down the kitchen chimney in a roaring white blizzard, and Vernon stood in the storm of his own undoing with a letter stuck to his mustache. And Harry understood that whoever was sending these did not get tired and did not run out and would not, on present evidence, ever stop. He turned the puzzle over while he scrubbed the grate, because scrubbing the grate was a task that left the mind free, and the cupboard had taught him to do his real thinking inside chores so that no one would notice he was thinking at all. Consider the eggs. A letter had come folded inside an egg. That was not a postman's trick. Postmen did not open eggs and reseal the shell. Someone had reached the egg before the grocer boxed it, or had put the letter where an egg would later be, which meant either a reach into the ordinary supply of the world so total it was indistinguishable from omniscience, or a willingness to break the laws Harry had been raised to believe were unbreakable. He had spent 10 years assuming the second kind of thing was impossible, because every adult he knew assured him it was, and he had also spent 10 years collecting events the adults could not explain and keeping them in a drawer. He took the drawer out now in his head while his hands moved on the cold iron, and he laid the wig that turned blue beside the letter and the egg, and the roof he could not have climbed beside the chimney that rained paper, and he looked at the collection altogether for once and understood that it was not a collection of accidents. It was a single phenomenon, seen from 10 different angles by a child who had been forbidden to give it a name. The forbidding, he saw now, had been the whole point. You do not nail a mail slot shut over nothing. That was the moment something in him went quiet and certain. Not hope. Hope was expensive, and he rarely bought it. Closer to a hypothesis confirmed. The world had a hidden chapter, and the hidden chapter was about him, and the people who maintained it were patient on a scale that made Vernon's fury look like a tantrum in a teacup. Whatever they were not amateurs. You did not arrange for 1,000 letters to find a sealed house unless you commanded a logistics that the ordinary world could not see. When Vernon broke, he broke toward distance. He bundled the family into the car on Sunday night with the wild eyes of a man outrunning a thing that had no legs, and he drove, and Harry watched the country thin out and gray through the window and did his arithmetic. They had turned away from London, away from people, toward the coast. The pursuers commanded letters, but not, apparently, the open sea. Vernon's whole plan rested on that premise. Harry suspected the premise was wrong, but he kept the suspicion to himself, because a correct prediction shared with Vernon was a beating, and a correct prediction kept to yourself was a small treasure you could spend later when it mattered. They came at last to a town hunched against gray water, and Vernon rented a boat from a man who plainly thought him mad, and they crossed a heaving stretch of sea to a rock with a shack on it. The shack had 2 rooms and a smell of rot and a fireplace that had given up. Outside, a storm was assembling itself on the horizon with the unhurried confidence of weather that knows it has all night. Vernon, having reached the farthest point from a mailbox that the British Isles allowed, sat in a moldy armchair with a triumph that Harry found almost unbearable to watch, because it was the triumph of a man who has bolted every window in a house that is already burning. Night fell. The storm arrived. Harry lay on the cold floor by the dead grate with Dudley's broken watch ticking on the wrist of the snoring lump above him on the sofa, and he counted down to his birthday, because it was the one piece of arithmetic that belonged to him alone. 10 minutes to midnight. The wind found every gap in the shack and made a low note of them, a chord with no resolution. The sea threw itself at the rock and fell back and threw itself again, tireless, the way the letters had been tireless, and Harry lay very still and felt the cold come up through the boards into his spine and thought, with the flat clarity he reserved for true things, they will not stop, and tomorrow I will be 11 and something is going to happen to me whether or not Vernon nails it shut. He was not afraid. He had budgeted fear out of his life years ago as a luxury that bought nothing. But under the not fear there was a pressure he had no word for, the pressure of a held breath that belongs to a whole life rather than a single chest, and it was in the grip of that pressure that he put his palm flat against the floorboards to push himself up, reaching for the one warm thought he had, which was that whoever wrote in green ink had known about the cupboard, had seen the smallest part of him and addressed it directly, and that this meant somewhere, somehow, he had been counted. The floor was warm. Not the warmth of a fire. The fire was dead and had been for an hour. He had watched the last ember go gray. This was a warmth that came up out of the rock itself, a low animal heat under the boards, in the dead center of the night, on a stone island in a freezing sea where nothing alive had any business being warm. Harry held his hand still and did the only honest thing, which was to notice fully that the data did not fit. Heat does not pool beneath a cold shack in a cold storm. Heat comes from somewhere. He pressed harder, spread his fingers, and felt it more clearly now, a faint, regular pulse against his palm, slow as a sleeping thing's heart, coming up through 3 inches of rotten pine from somewhere below. There was no below. They had crossed open sea to rock. He had seen the rock from the boat, a ward of stone barely wider than the shack, sheer on all sides, no cave, no door, no anything but the shack and the gulls and the gray. And yet under his hand the rock had a pulse and a warmth, and when he leaned his ear to the boards and held his breath against the wind, a sound, not the sea. The sea was a roar with a rhythm. This was a tone, a single sustained note pitched just below hearing, the sound a struck bell makes in the last second before the sound ends, held forever, never ending. He felt it in his teeth more than his ears. He looked at Dudley's watch, 3 minutes to midnight. A reasonable child would have woken his uncle. Harry waited for exactly as long as the thought took to form and discarded it, because waking Vernon would purchase a beating and nothing else, and because there was a rule he had lived by in the cupboard that he had never put into words until that moment on the cold floor. When the world finally shows you the seam in its story, you do not call for the people who taught you the story was seamless. You go to the seam alone, and you look. He moved Dudley's watch arm aside, gently, so the snoring did not change its rhythm, and he went on his hands and knees to the place where the warmth was strongest, in the angle where the floor met the cold hearthstone. The hearthstone was a single slab, man-high in length, set flush with the boards, and the pulse beat strongest at its edge. He worked his fingers into the gap between stone and wood. The mortar there was old and soft and came away in his fingers like wet bread, far softer than mortar that has held a hearth together for a century has any right to be, the way a thing comes loose when it has been waiting a long while for fingers exactly the right size. He did not let himself believe that. Believing things made you stupid. He had watched it make Vernon stupid for years. He simply pulled, and the slab, which should have weighed as much as he did and more, swung up on the far edge weightless and silent, pivoting on nothing, and from the black space beneath it, the note rose to meet him and the warmth came up over his face like the breath of a sleeping giant, and there were stairs. Stairs going down, into a rock that had no down. They were narrow and they were stone and they were old in a way the shack was not old the way mountains are old, worn in their centers by feet that had passed and passed and passed and then for a very long time not passed at all. They descended into a darkness that was not black but a deep silver gray, lit by no lamp Harry could see, a light with no source, the color of the inside of a shell. The air that rose from them was dry and warm and smelled of stone and of something else under the stone, a smell he would not have a name for until much later and would then never forget. Old parchment, the smell of words kept past the death of everyone who wrote them. Harry knelt at the lip of the hole with the storm screaming over the roof and the impossible stairs breathing up at him and performed, very quickly, the most important calculation of his life, and did not yet know it was the most important. The case against going down was complete and obvious. He did not know what was below. Nobody knew he was here. If the slab fell shut he would die in the dark, and no one in the world would think to look beneath a hearth on a rock in the sea, because no one in the world but him knew there was a beneath. Every survival instinct the cupboard had drilled into him said the same thing. An unknown door in an unknown place at midnight is a trap, and traps are for animals that mistake the bait for the meal. The case for going down was only this. For 10 years he had been the variable the world refused to look at, and now the world had warmth and light and a sound like a held bell waiting under a stone that had moved for his hand and no one else's. The letters had known his cupboard. This had known his fingers. Twice now in a single fortnight the hidden chapter had reached up and addressed him by name. A boy could spend a whole life waiting to be counted, and here was the count, and he could lie back down on the cold floor and be Harry Potter of the cupboard for the rest of his small-budgeted life, or he could go and see what had his name on it. It was not, when he put it that way, a difficult sum. He went back across the floor, soundless, and gathered his few things, which were nothing, the broken glasses on his face, the 2 big clothes on his back. He looked once at the sleeping shapes of the only family he had, Dudley sprawled and slack, Vernon and Petunia behind the thin partition snoring in counterpoint, and he felt for them the careful nothing he had trained himself to feel about whether he had learned to dress for. He owed them no goodbye, and they would want none. The watch on Dudley's wrist read 1 minute to midnight, the little hand and the big hand closing toward each other like a thing about to be decided, and Harry Potter, who had 11 years of being 11 about to begin, stepped down onto the first stair and then the second, and behind him, gentle as a closing eye, the hearthstone settled back into its bed and sealed the storm and the snoring and the whole ordinary roaring world away above him, and the silver dark took him in. The stairs went down a long way. He counted them because counting was what he did with fear he refused to name, and the count climbed past where the sea floor should have been, past where any sane geometry placed the bottom of anything, 200 steps, 300, the silver light never brightening and never dimming, the held note swelling around him until it was less a sound than a medium, a thing he walked through. The walls on either side were close enough to touch, and he touched them, and they were warm and dry and carved, he realized, all of them carved, covered floor to invisible ceiling in lines too fine to be ornament. A script that ran on and on without repeating, marching down beside him as he descended, and he could not read a word of it, and yet the longer he looked the more it seemed to him that the words were aware of being looked at. That they turned some attention of their own toward the small, cold creature passing among them, the way a library at night might turn toward the one reader who has stayed too late. He tried once to read a single line of it, because the cupboard had taught him that the way to make a frightening thing smaller was to learn its name. He fixed his eyes on a run of the carved characters at shoulder height and held them there, and the characters held him back. They did not resolve into letters. They did not become a code he could begin to crack. Instead, the longer he looked the more it seemed that the looking ran the wrong direction, that the script was reading him, drawing some slow, patient inference from the shape of his attention, totting up a long account of the small, cold creature who had presumed to come down. He took his eyes off it. A person learned in a house run on a budget of attention exactly when to stop being looked at, and he applied the lesson now to a wall of words older than England, and felt the wall lose interest by degrees, the way an adult loses interest in a child who has gone still and harmless. The stairs kept descending. The light kept not having a source. Somewhere far below, the held note of the bell waited for him, with the patience of a thing that had already waited longer than the human race had owned fire, and Harry went down toward it counting, because the count was the one wall the dark could not read. At the 412th step the stairs ended and the chamber opened, and Harry stopped, and for once his careful inner accounting simply stopped along with him, because some quantities are too large to count, and the mind, confronted with them, sets down its pencil. It was vast. That was the first wrong thing and the most total. It was a single round hall wider than the whole of Privet Drive and higher than he could see, the silver light thinning to dusk far overhead where a ceiling should have been, and instead there was only more height, and the walls curved away on both hands into distances that the rock above could not contain, that the sea could not contain, that the round small world he had crossed by boat could not have held in any honest accounting of its volume. The chamber was bigger than the rock that held it. The chamber was, by every measure his eyes could take, bigger than it was possible for it to be, and he stood at the foot of the stair and understood with a cold and exhilarating completeness that he had walked at last all the way out of the world that had a story about itself, and into the chapter the story had been written to hide. The hall was not empty. Around its curving wall, ring above ring climbing up into the silver dusk, ran shelves, and on the shelves stood the source of the parchment smell. Books, scrolls, tablets of stone and slate and metal, cases of instruments whose purpose he could not guess, models of moving things that turned slowly on their own with no hand to turn them, the accumulated hoard of some discipline that had gathered knowledge the way the sea gathers salt, patiently across an age. The floor was a single disk of pale stone inlaid with a vast figure he stood too close to read, lines of inlaid silver running out from beneath his feet to the distant walls. And in the center of the hall, in the exact center where the inlaid lines all met, there stood a thing that drew his eye and held it the way the warmth had drawn his hand, a frame of black metal, taller than a man, and within the frame, suspended on nothing, a single bell. It was not ringing, it hung motionless. And yet the note that filled the hall, the held tone he had followed down 400 stairs, the sound that was in his teeth and his spine and the soles of his feet, came from it, from a bell that did not move, that had perhaps been struck once a very long time ago, and had simply never been permitted to stop, a sound caught in the act of sounding, and held there against the patient erosion of every second since. Harry looked at the bell that rang without ringing and felt the arithmetic come back to him at last, reassembling itself out of wonder into a single clean and frightening line. Time was wrong here. That was what the bell was telling him. A struck bell decays because each instant takes a little of its sound away. A bell that had been struck and did not decay was a bell standing in a place where the instants did not pass, or did not pass the way they passed above, where a second was not being spent at the ordinary rate. He stood very still and tested it against his own body. His heart, which he could find at his throat if he was quiet, was beating slow. Not from calm, he was not calm. From the medium, the held note was not slow because the bell was slow. It was slow because here, at the bottom of 400 impossible stairs, in a hall larger than the stone that held it, time itself had been set to a different and a vaster clock, and he had walked into the machinery of it, and the storm and the snoring and his 11th birthday, a minute away above him, were running on the thin surface of a thing whose depths he had only begun to fall through. A voice spoke out of the silver air, dry and worn and gentle, the voice of something that had not used speech in a great while and was glad in its faded way to use it again. "It has been," the voice said, "such a long time since anyone small enough came down the stairs." Harry did not jump. He had trained the jump out of himself in a house where being startled was a thing Dudley collected. He turned slowly toward the voice and found near the central bell a figure he had taken for one of the slow-turning models. A shape of pale light worn thin as a held breath, neither quite a man nor quite a ghost, an old presence in the robe of an order that had no name he knew, looking at him out of eyes that were kind and tired and very, very deep. "You are afraid," said the figure, "and you are not running. That is rare. The brave run, the clever run faster. Only a particular sort stays to count the stairs." A flicker that on a living face would have meant something Harry had no permission to name moved across the worn light. "Tell me your arithmetic, child. You felt the warmth. You came down. You have understood the bell. So tell me what you have worked out standing there, and I will tell you whether you are right." Harry looked at the bell that rang without ringing, and at the hall that was bigger than the world above it, and at the shelves climbing ring on ring into a dusk full of every word that anyone had ever bothered to keep, and he heard his own voice come out steadier than the cold in his chest had any right to allow. "Down here," he said, "time is slow, or up there it's fast, one of them." He looked at the figure of worn light. How slow. The faded eyes regarded him, and something in them that might once, long ago, have been laughter stirred and settled. "Above you," said the figure, "the storm is blowing and a clock is reaching for midnight, and it will go on reaching for one full night, and in the morning the rain will stop. One night, that is what the world will spend up there while you are down here with me." Light leaned closer and the held note swelled, and Harry felt the whole vast slow machinery of the place turn its attention onto him, the way the carved walls had turned, the way the letters had found the cupboard, the way the warmth had found his hand. "And down here, child, in that one night, you will have 1,000 years." Harry did the multiplication before he did anything else, because the multiplication was the kind of thing his mind reached for, the way another body reaches for a handhold over a drop. 1,000 years in a night, 365,000 days in the dark, while a single gray morning assembled itself overhead. The number was so large that it stopped being a number and became a weather, a climate he was being invited to live inside, and the part of him that had folded blankets into mattresses and rationed inches in a cupboard looked at the climate of it and did not know whether he was being offered a gift or a grave. "Why," he said, "would anyone build this?" It was the right question. He could tell by the way the worn light steadied, the way a tired teacher steadies when a pupil, by accident or instinct, steps onto the actual path instead of one of the pretty ones beside it. "We were called the Horologers," said the figure. "There is no one left to mind whether you have heard the name, so I will give it to you freely. We were wizards who fell in love with the one thing magic could never simply hand us, not gold, not power. There are 100 easy roads to gold and power, and they all run downhill. We wanted time, the one currency no spell could counterfeit and no vault could hold. A wizard may live 3 lifetimes of an ordinary man and still die with his great work half finished, his question half answered, the next page of the book forever just out of reach. We were tired of dying with the page unturned." The light moved, and the vast, slow hall seemed to turn with it, the rings of shelves wheeling at the edge of sight. "So we did not buy more years. We learned instead to spend the years we had more slowly. We carved a place out of the side of the world where the river of hours pools and turns and barely moves, and we came down here one by one, and we read and we worked and we thought, for as long as 1,000 seasons, while the gulls above us did not finish a single cry. We turned one night into a scholar's whole long life, and then we climbed the stairs, and the world had not noticed we were gone." "It worked," Harry said. He was looking at the bell. "You're still here." "It worked," the figure agreed, "and it cost, and you have already guessed that it cost, because you are the sort who counts the stairs." The kindness in the worn light did not lessen, but something underneath it set, the way the sea sets into ice. "Listen to me now, child, because I will only have the strength to say the important things once, and there are 3. The first is this: the chamber will keep you. You will not starve, and you will not freeze, and you will not age a single day of your body, because the deepest working of this place is a kind of memory. It holds the shape you walked in with, and it gives that shape back to you at the threshold, whatever has happened to you in between. You came down a boy of 11. You will climb up a boy of 11, in flesh, in face, in every inch a careless eye could measure. That is the mercy of the chamber, and it is also its cruelty, and you do not yet understand why, and you will." Harry kept very still and let the words land and counted them, because 3 was a number he could hold. "And the second thing is that you cannot leave until the night ends. The door above is not locked. It is simply not there, not for you. Not until the sun comes up on the world and the working I have begun by speaking to you runs its course. You felt the warmth and you came down of your own will, and that was the only choice the chamber will let you make freely. The rest is already moving. When you stepped onto the first stair, you began a night that will be 1,000 years long to you, and a single turning of the dark to them, and there is no stair back up until that night is spent. Do you understand what I am telling you? I am telling you that you have already chosen. I am only being courteous enough to explain the choice after the fact, because the horologers were many things and discourteous was not among them. A reasonable person would have felt the floor go out from under him at that. Harry checked. With the cold honesty he checked everything, and found that he did not. The world had been a sealed house with a knocking door his whole life, and he had spent that whole life pretending, like Vernon, that the knocking was nothing. He had stopped pretending the moment the hearthstone floated up for his hand. A boy who has decided to open the door does not get to be aghast that it has opened. He had run the sum on the stairs and the sum had said go down, and the only new information was that the sum had been more permanent than he knew, and a permanent sum was, on balance, easier than a reversible one. There was a strange, clean relief in a thing that could not be taken back. The cupboard had taught him that the worst feeling in the world was a small good thing held over your head and withdrawn. 1,000 years that no one could withdraw was, by that measure, the largest safe thing he had ever been handed. All right, he said, the third thing. The figure of worn light was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet the held note of the bell seemed to deepen, to take on the weight of the thing that had not yet been said. The third thing, said the cartographer, for that was the name it gave itself then, the last of the order who had stayed behind to draw the maps for any soul that ever came down the stairs again, is the only warning I have, and it is the one that matters, and it is the one the young never believe until the years have made them old enough to believe it, by which time the believing is too late to be of use. So I will say it plainly, and you will not understand it, and then in 200 years, in 400, you will understand it all at once on some gray morning that is like every other gray morning, and you will remember that an old light in an old hall told you so. The deep eyes held him. 1,000 years alone will not kill you, the chamber sees to that. 1,000 years alone will do something worse, which is that it will offer to make you into something that no longer needs the world it is preparing you to return to. It will hollow out the child and leave a discipline standing in his clothes. You will learn everything on these shelves, and the learning is real, and the power at the end of it is real, and none of that is the danger. The danger is the silence between the lessons. The danger is the 10,000th identical morning. The danger is that you will become so good at being alone that when the door finally opens you will not remember why you ever wanted it to. Harry looked up at the rings of shelves climbing into the silver dusk, every word that anyone had thought worth keeping, gathered and waiting, and the size of the offer settled onto him at last, not as wonder now but as work, the way a roof settles onto a frame. Then how do you survive it, he said. If you know all that, how did you? We mostly did not, said the cartographer, and did not soften it. Most who came down came for the power, and the power was happy to be wanted and ate them from the inside while they thanked it. A few of us lasted, and the few who lasted all did the same thing, and it is the only true thing I have to teach you, so hold it the way you held the count of the stairs. We each kept one door we refused to open, one small, ordinary thing from the life above that we would not let the discipline have. A name. A face, a taste, a wrong we meant to right, or a person we meant to find. We did not visit it often. We did not let the years wear it smooth. We simply kept it locked and kept it ours, and on the mornings when the silence offered to take everything, we would put a hand against that one closed door in the dark of our own minds and feel that it was still there, still warm, still refusing, and that was enough to be a person for one more century. The light was thinning as it spoke, guttering like a candle that has given most of what it had to the speaking. You are very young and very alone and very good at being so, and that will keep you alive down here, and it will be the thing that nearly costs you everything. So choose your door now before the years begin in earnest. Choose the one thing you will not let 1,000 years take, and do not tell me what it is. A door you have spoken aloud is a door that someone can knock on. Harry stood in the center of the impossible hall, under the bell that rang without ringing, and thought about the green ink that had known his cupboard. He thought about a scar in the shape of a stroke of lightning and a story about a car crash that a hand had guarded rather than told. He thought about the smallest part of himself, the part the world had addressed by name when it finally addressed him at all, and he found that the door chose itself, and that he would, exactly as instructed, keep its contents to himself. He gave the cartographer a nod, the precise economical nod of a boy who has understood an instruction and intends to follow it and sees no profit in saying so. I've chosen, he said. Good. The worn light gathered itself for one more effort, and the deep eyes found him a final time before the long teaching that would fill the first 100 years could begin. Then we will start where everyone starts, child, and we will go as slowly as 1,000 years allows, which is very slowly indeed. Pick up the first book, not because you can read it. You cannot. Pick it up so that your hands remember, on the 10,000th morning, what it was for. Everything down here begins with the willingness to hold a thing you do not yet understand and refuse to put it down. Above, on the rotten floor of a shack on a rock in the sea, Dudley's broken watch ticked over to midnight, and Harry Potter turned 11 and did not feel it, because he was already 100 feet and 400 stairs in the first hour of 1,000 years away, reaching up with both hands toward the lowest shelf in the first of all the books, while the bell held its single note over him like a sky that would not, for 10 centuries, permit a single dawn. Chapter 1 and Chapter 2. The long night there is a sound 1,000 years makes, and it is not loud, and Harry Potter would spend the first decade of his eternity learning to hear it. It was the held note of the bell, and at first he thought it was silence. The cartographer corrected him on the point during what they later agreed to call the second year, though neither of them could have measured the year against any honest clock. Silence is the absence of sound, the worn light said. What you are standing inside is the presence of one sound, sustained past the death of every ear that should have heard it end. They are not the same. The first will let you go mad in comfort. The second will keep you honest. Learn to tell them apart and you will survive your first century. Confuse them and you will not. Harry learned to tell them apart. It was the first lesson, and like all the important ones, it was disguised as a remark. The teaching began where the cartographer had promised, with a book he could not read, and the not reading lasted longer than the Dursleys had owned their house. The script on the walls and the script in the books were the same script, and the cartographer named it the Old Tongue, and explained, with the patience of a thing that had nothing left to be impatient about, that it was not a language for talking. It was the language magic spoke to itself before any wizard dressed it up in Latin and waved a stick. A spell, the cartographer said, was a sentence in the Old Tongue with most of the words filed off, a brutal abbreviation that worked the way pointing and grunting worked, well enough to get bread, never well enough to get truth. Your kind says lumos and a light comes and they think they have commanded light. They have done nothing of the sort. They have leaned on a word the way a tired man leans on a wall, and the wall, being kind, holds them up. I am going to teach you to build the wall. So Harry learned to build walls. He learned the Old Tongue the way a drowning man learns water, by being in it with no other option, and the chamber helped because the chamber was made of it. The carved walls that had read him on the stairs turned out to be a grammar he could walk through. By what he reckoned as the 40th year he could read the lowest ring of shelves. By the 80th he had read it twice and understood perhaps a third. The understanding was the slow part. Anyone can move their eyes across a line. To know why the Old Tongue put the verb of a binding spell before its object, and what it cost the universe each time you reversed them, and why the reversal was forbidden in 11 scripts and merely discouraged in the 12th, took years that a person with a life to live could not have spent. Harry had no life to live. He had 1,000 years and a bell, and he spent the years on the grammar, and the grammar began by degrees to spend itself on him. The cartographer did not last. Harry had known it was coming in the abstract way one knows the sun will eventually go out, which is to say not at all in the way that mattered. The worn light had been thin on the night he came down, and the thinness was not a style. It was a quantity, and the quantity was running out. Every lesson cost it something it could not replace, and it spent itself on him anyway, with what Harry would only much later have the vocabulary to call generosity, because at the time he had decided not to keep a vocabulary for things that would hurt to name. Near the end of what he thought of as the first century, the light could no longer hold a human shape for a full lesson. It frayed at the edges of a sentence. It forgot once the word for a tool it had used 10,000 times and was quiet for a long while afterward, and then said, "You see, this is the thing I warned you of, beginning in me. The forgetting comes for the old before it comes for the alone. You will have both, be ready to be both." The last lesson was short. The cartographer gathered what it had into the rough shape of a person, one final time, and looked at the child it had taught for 100 years, the child who had not aged a day in flesh and had aged a century in everything else, and it said the last true thing it would ever say. I have given you the grammar and the warning. The grammar will make you powerful. The warning will keep you a person if you let it, which you will not want to on the bad mornings. Do not mistake the powerful thing for the person. They will wear the same face, yours. A pause in which the held note of the bell was the only voice in the hall. I kept a door all my years. It was a road in a country that no longer exists, and a woman who walked down it ahead of me not looking back, and the not looking back was the whole of it, because if she had looked back I would have had to choose, and I never did have to choose, and that mercy lasted me 800 years. Keep your door, Harry Potter. I am about to stop being able to remind you. And then the light was a scatter of motes, and then it was the ordinary silver of the hall, and then Harry was alone, and the bell held its note, and no one corrected his pronunciation ever again. He did not weep. He had not wept since he was small enough to believe it changed an outcome, and he did not start now, with no audience and no point. What he did instead was sit on the cold floor at the center of the hall for what he later estimated as 11 days, doing nothing, holding the last book the cartographer had assigned, the way the cartographer had told him on the first night to hold a book he could not read so that his hands would remember what it was for. His hands remembered. That was the thing about the chamber's cruelty he had not understood on the first night and understood now. 1,000 years would take everything it could pry loose, and the one defense was to give your hands and your tongue and your spine a thing to remember that the years could not reach, and to practice the remembering before the forgetting came, so that when the forgetting came, the remembering would already be a reflex, older and stupider and more loyal than thought. He had been given the warning twice now. He intended to be the rare student who believed it the first time, and he was honest enough even then to suspect he would fail. The first century had a teacher. The second had only the work, and the work was enough for a while because there is a kind of person for whom a problem is a country they can emigrate to, and Harry was that kind, had been since the cupboard, where a dishwasher's spray arm had been a more reliable companion than any human in the house. He learned the wand darts, and then he learned to throw the wand away. This was heresy where he came from, an arithmetic where he was. A wand, the books explained and the walls confirmed, was a crutch shaped like a focus, a way for a frightened animal to lie to itself that the power lived in the stick. The power lived in the wizard. The stick only gave the fear something to hold. Harry had budgeted fear out of his life on a cold floor in a shack 100 subjective years and 1 objective hour ago, and so he set the wand down, and for 40 years he failed to light a candle without it, and on the 41st year the candle lit, and he understood that he had spent 4 decades unlearning a lie that the world above would spend its whole history believing. He lit the candle again. He lit 10,000 candles. He lit a candle every morning for a century until lighting a candle without a wand was less remarkable to him than blinking, and then he moved on, because the chamber had taught him the cruelest and most useful truth of mastery, which is that the only proof you have learned a thing is that it has stopped being interesting. He built the house in his mind in the 3rd century, and the house saved him in the 5th. The mind arts had a dull name in the books, occlumency, the closing of the mind, and the dull name hid the largest idea in the chamber. A mind, the old tongue said, was not a thing but a place, and a place could be built, and a thing that has been built on purpose is harder to knock down than a thing that grew by accident, which is what most minds were, lean-tos of habit thrown up against the weather of a life. Harry took his accidental mind apart and built a deliberate one, room by room, across 30 years of subjective labor. He built a long, cold corridor first, because the cupboard had taught him corridors, and off the corridor he built rooms, and in the rooms he put the things a person needs to stay a person. A room for the grammar, a room for the candle, a room for the dueling forms he had not yet learned but was leaving space for, the way a careful builder leaves a stair to a floor not yet added. And at the end of the corridor, past every other room, behind a door he built thicker than all the rest and then built thicker again. He put the one thing he had chosen on the first night and would not look at, and he did not look at it, and the not looking was a discipline he practiced as rigorously as the candle, because the cartographer had been right that the door mattered and righter that the temptation would be to wear it smooth with visiting until there was nothing behind it worth the wall. The house had a window. He was proud of the window. In the flat way he allowed himself a feeling on the rare occasion a feeling had earned its keep. The window looked out on a road in a country that did not exist, a road he had built from the cartographer's last words because he had nothing of his own old enough to furnish the view, and a figure walked down the road ahead of him and never looked back, and that was where he went on the mornings when the silence offered to take everything. He would stand at the window of a house inside his own skull, inside a hall bigger than the rock that held it, inside a night that the world above had not finished, and he would watch a borrowed stranger walk a borrowed road and not look back, and the not looking back would remind him that he too was walking towards something and not away from everything, and the reminder would last him on the good mornings a week. On the bad mornings it lasted an hour. He learned to count the mornings by how long the window held. The 5th century was when he learned to die. He had reached the dueling forms by then, and the dueling forms had a problem that the candle and the grammar did not, which was that you cannot learn to fight alone. The chamber, it turned out, had anticipated the problem the way it had anticipated hunger and cold. Among the lost arts on the higher shelves was the conjuring of echoes, the calling up out of the archives of the recorded shapes of wizards long dead, not their souls, which were beyond any shelf, but their forms and their methods, the way a duelist of the 3rd dynasty had held a guard, the way a battle mage of the drowned cities had opened with 7 curses braided into one. Harry called them up. He fought them. They were not company, and he never once let himself pretend they were, because pretending the echoes were company was exactly the road the cartographer had warned him not to walk, the road where the discipline puts on the face of a person and you thank it. They were tools. He fought his tools, and at first his tools killed him. Dying in the chamber did not kill him, because the chamber held the shape he had entered with and gave it back at the threshold of each bout. The same mercy that kept his body 11 turned now to a darker and more useful purpose. He would take a curse through the heart from the echo of a duelist 9,000 years dead, and the world would go white and silent, and the held note of the bell would swallow him, and then he would be standing again at the chalk line at the start of the bout with the memory of his own death intact and instructive, a memory he could turn over in his hands like a stone, learning the precise angle of the guard he should have held. He died across the centuries, more times than any wizard in the history of the world had died once. He died until death was a teacher with a dull voice and a good curriculum, until the white silence held no more terror than a closed book, until he understood in his marrow rather than his theory the single fact that would unbalance every enemy he ever faced above, that a person who has genuinely stopped being afraid to die has removed the one lever by which the powerful move the weak. He had not stopped valuing his life, he had simply stopped flinching from its end, the way a man who has walked 1,000 miles stops flinching from the next step. The flinch is where they get you. He had worn his out. There was one echo he kept longest because it took him the longest to beat, and beating it taught him more than any book on the ring above. The archives named it only by its method, the braided 7, the recorded form of a battle mage of the drowned cities who had opened every duel of her life with 7 curses woven into a single strand, so that a man parrying the first found the second already inside his guard, and the third arriving where the parry had left him open. Harry called her up and she killed him before he understood what he was looking at. She killed him the second time while he was still admiring the first. By the 100th death he could name all 7 curses. By the 1,000th he could survive the opening and lose to the middle game. The chamber set him back at the chalk line each time with the white silence still ringing in his teeth and the knowledge of exactly how he had died laid out cold and clean for study, and he studied it year upon year, a child fighting the ghost of a woman who had been ash before the pyramids, until the morning came when he met the braided 7 and did not parry it at all. He had understood somewhere in the 900th year that the strand was woven to defeat a defense, and that the answer to a thing woven to defeat a defense was to mount no defense, to step instead inside the weave before it tightened, close enough to feel the heat of all 7 curses passing behind his back at once, and end the bout in the half-second the form had never been built to survive. He stepped inside. The echo came apart into motes. He stood alone on the inlaid floor with his heart going slow and even, and he did not feel triumph, because triumph was a feeling for people who had been in doubt, and he had stopped being in doubt several centuries before he stopped being afraid. This was the gift and this was the cost, and the cost was that somewhere in the dying he stopped counting the years. He noticed the gap a long time after it opened, which was how he knew it had opened. He had been a counter since the cupboard. Counting was the wall the dark could not read, the 412 stairs, the 12 letters on Thursday, the decades to the candle. And then there came a morning, identical to the 10,000 before it, when he reached for the count out of reflex and found that he did not have it, that he had let it go untended through some number of years he could not now recover precisely, because the count was the very thing that would have told him. And he stood in the hall holding the absence of his own arithmetic and recognized it for what the cartographer had promised it would be. The forgetting arriving on schedule on a gray morning like every other gray morning, exactly as foretold, too late to be argued with. He went to the window in the house in his mind. The road was there. The figure was there, walking, not looking back. He held the window for a long time and it held him, and when he came back to the hall he made a decision that he understood even then was the most important he had made since the stairs, more important than the wand or the grammar or the dying. He decided to keep being a person on purpose, since he could no longer do it by accident. It is one thing to remain yourself because the years have not yet come for you. It is another to remain yourself after the years have come and taken what they came for and left you standing in the wreck deciding whether to rebuild the house or move into the discipline and let the house fall down. The discipline made the better offer. The discipline always makes the better offer. That is what makes it the discipline. It promised him an end to the ache of the window, an end to the borrowed road and the borrowed stranger, an end to the exhausting daily labor of being a small warm thing in a vast cold hall. It offered to make him into the hall itself, patient and enormous and unbothered, a presence rather than a person, and it pointed out reasonably that a presence cannot be hurt and a person can, and that he had a great deal of hurting still ahead of him in the world above, and would he not rather meet it as the hall than as the child? He considered the offer across what might have been 50 years. It was the closest he came in 1,000 of them to losing. There was a morning near the floor of the long night that he came as close to stopping as a living thing can come and still go on. He could not afterward say what was different about it. That was its horror, that it was different in nothing. The light was the silver light. The bell held the note. He woke on the cold floor where he had taken to sleeping because beds were a comfort he no longer trusted, and he looked up at 400 rings of shelves he had read to the last character, and he could not find, anywhere in the vast mansion of his built mind, a single reason to stand up that the discipline could not have supplied more cheaply by letting him become the floor. He lay there for what might have been a season. The discipline sat with him, patient and enormous, and did not gloat because it had no need to. It simply waited the way the hall waited, the way the bell waited, and pointed out without unkindness that standing was a habit and habits could be set down, and that he had set down so many already, the wand, the count, the sound of every voice, and what was one more, what was the last one. He came near to agreeing. What he did instead in the end was move one hand, not to stand. Only to lay his palm flat against the cold stone the way he had once laid it flat against a warm floorboard in a shack in the sea, 10 centuries gone, on the night the world had first run its slow finger down the seam of its own story and let him in. The stone was not warm. But the gesture was old, older than the despair, a thing his hand remembered from before he was strong enough to be in danger of becoming the hall, and the hand finished what the mind could not begin and pushed, and he sat up, and that was all. That was the whole of the victory. He had learned by then that the largest victories are the smallest motions, and that a person is not a thing you are but a thing you do, every morning one hand at a time. What saved him was not strength. He had stopped believing in strength as a thing distinct from habit somewhere in the 3rd century. What saved him was a smell. He had been reading on the 400th ring, high up where the air was thin and the books were stranger, and he had pulled down a slim case of pressed leaves. an herbarium of plants that no longer grew, and he had opened it without expectation. And out of it had come the smell of green growing things, of rain on a hedge, of a world with weather in it, the smell of the surface of the earth that he had not breathed in some uncountable number of years. And the smell went down the long, cold corridor of the house in his mind and put its hand against the thick door at the end, the door he never opened, and the thing behind the door answered. It did not open. He had built it too well for that, and he was glad, the flat, allowed gladness, that he had built it too well. But it answered, a warmth against his palm through a foot of imagined oak, still there, still his, still refusing. And the warmth reminded him in a language older than the old tongue that he had chosen to walk toward something, that there was a world up the stairs with rain in it and hedges in it and a person somewhere, who had once written his name on an envelope and put the cupboard in the address because they had seen the smallest part of him and counted it worth seeing. And that he had promised himself on the first night that he would climb back up and find out who. He closed the herbarium. He did not move into the discipline. He went back to work, but the work had changed because the worker had nearly stopped and chosen not to, and a thing you have chosen is different from a thing you have merely never questioned. He had questioned it now. He had stood at the lip of becoming the hall and had stepped back, and the stepping back was the second most important calculation of his life. And unlike the first, he made it more than once, every bad morning, for the rest of the long night, each time a little faster, until choosing to be a person was its own kind of reflex, older and stupider, and more loyal than the discipline that wanted to replace it. The loneliness was not what the books above would have called loneliness, because that word was built for an absence of days or weeks, and what Harry lived in had no bottom the word could reach. He talked in the early centuries to keep the machine of speech from rusting, and he was careful only ever to talk to himself and never to the echoes, never to the hall, because the day you begin answering the silence as though it can hear you is the day the discipline has won and put on your face. He recited the grammar aloud. He argued both sides of a problem in two voices, and made sure he always knew which voice was his. Once in a year he could not number, he could not remember the sound of any voice but his own, could not summon Petunia's flat vowels or the cartographer's worn music or the boom of a fist on a door, and the not remembering frightened him more than any death at the chalk line, and he wrote everything he could still recall of the world above into a book of his own. 1,000 pages in a hand that grew steadier even as its writer grew stranger, every fact he owned about a place with weather in it. Then he read it once and burned it in a conjured flame, because he understood that a man who needs a book to remember he is a person has already half forgotten, and that the only safe place to keep the world was behind the thick door where the years could not get a grip, in the warmth he refused to look at, in the one room he had built too well to lose. The disciplines themselves he finished, because 1,000 years is long enough to finish anything, even the lost arts, even the ones the drowned cities had died with half-learned. He learned the healing arts by the only honest road, which was to injure himself and mend himself and injure himself again, until he knew the body the way a man knows a house he has rebuilt after every kind of fire, which bone forgives quickly and which holds a grudge, how to close a wound so it leaves no story, and how to leave the story in on purpose when a story was useful. He learned the working of wards, the grammar of protection, the way to make a threshold that would let a friend pass and stop a god, though he had no friend yet to test it on and no god, only the echoes who were neither. He learned the reading of minds, and harder, the closing of his own so completely that a reader would find not a wall, which announces that something is being hidden, but a plausible empty room, furnished with exactly the dull thoughts an 11-year-old ought to have, a false front behind which the real house stood untouched. He practiced the false front for a century. He suspected he would need it up the stairs against someone grandfatherly and probing, though he did not yet have a face to hang the suspicion on. And he learned the time arts last because they were the chamber's own, and the chamber did not give them cheaply. They were on the highest ring, where the silver dusk was thickest and the held note of the bell was less a sound than a pressure behind the eyes, and they were the reason the horologers had built the place and the reason none of them had walked out of it the same, and Harry read them slowly, with the particular care of a man diffusing the thing that had made him. He learned why the bell held its note. He learned that the dilation was not a spell laid on the hall but a wound in the world, a place where the fabric had been cut and folded so that one side ran slow against the other, and that the fold was held open by the bell, and that the bell had been struck by a wizard whose name had been filed off every script as a kindness to his memory, and that the strike was still happening, would always be happening, one eternal present instant of a hammer meeting bronze. Because inside the fold the instant of the strike could not finish any more than the morning above could finish, and that this was the engine, the unfinished strike, the note that could not decay because decay is a thing that takes time, and here there was no time to take. He understood it. He could not have built it. Building it had cost a name and probably a soul. But he understood it, and understanding it, he understood his own scar. He had not thought about the scar in centuries. It was on the face he no longer saw, in the body the chamber held in trust, and a person stops thinking about a face he cannot see. But the time arts put a tool in his hands, and the tool, turned inward out of idle mastery, found the scar and found that it was not a scar. It was a fold. A small one, a clumsy one, nothing like the vast, deliberate cut that held the bell. A fold made in panic and rage rather than patience and grief, but the same kind of wound in the same kind of fabric, and there was something on the far side of it, folded in against him. A sliver of an attention that was not his, sleeping, patient, waiting for a clock it did not know had been changed. Harry examined it the way he examined everything, fully, without flinching, because he had worn the flinch out. He did not remove it. He could have, he thought, with care, but removing it would announce to whatever it was attached to that the fold had been found, and 1,000 years had taught him the value of a card not yet played. He simply learned it, the shape and the temperature and the slow sleeping hunger of it, and he closed the false front a little tighter around the room where he kept the knowing, and he understood, with the cold completeness he had felt only twice before, on the stairs and at the window, that the world above had not merely hidden a chapter about him. It had folded an enemy into his skull when he was a year old, and the enemy was still there, and the enemy did not know that the child it had marked had gone away into a fold of his own and come back 1,000 years deep. That was the last thing he learned, and after it there was nothing left on any shelf he had not read, and the chamber, having given him everything it had, began at last to let him go. He felt it in the bell. He had lived inside the held note so long that he heard it the way you hear your own blood, which is to say not at all until it changes, and one morning, after a number of years he could not count because he had long since stopped counting, the note changed. It did not stop. It began by an increment so small that only a man who had spent a millennium inside it could have caught it to decay. The unfinished strike was finishing. The morning above was ending. Somewhere a hammer that had been meeting bronze for 10 centuries of his life and one night of the world's was completing its blow, and the sound was going to be permitted finally to die. And when it died the fold would close and the stairs would open and 1,000 years would be over and a single night would be done. Harry stood in the center of the hall where he had stood at the beginning under the bell, on the inlaid figure he had long since walked far enough back to read, and listened to the note come down. It took in the end what he guessed was 3 years to fade, which was the chamber's last lesson and its kindest, that even an ending, when it finally comes slowly enough to say goodbye to. He used the 3 years to make himself ready, not for Hogwarts, which he could have walked into in an afternoon, but for the harder thing, the thing the discipline had offered to spare him, and the door had refused to let him skip. He made himself ready to be 11. It was the most difficult magic he had ever attempted, and there was no book for it. He had to take a mind 1,000 years deep and fold it down, not away, never away. He had learned the cost of away, but down, into a shape that could sit in a small body and answer to a small name, and let small people believe they were teaching him to levitate a feather. He built the last room of the house for it, near the front, a bright ordinary room with a window onto Privet Drive instead of the borrowed road, and he furnished it with everything an 11-year-old should have and almost nothing he actually was, and he practiced living in that front room while the vast cold mansion stood dark and patient behind it, and he got good at it because he got good at everything, because 1,000 years is long enough to get good at anything, even at hiding 1,000 years. He rehearsed the concealment the way he had rehearsed everything, against the hardest opponent the archives held, which for this work was not a duelist but a reader. There was an echo on the third ring of a mind-walker of the old courts, a probing patient intelligence that had made its living finding the one true thought a liar hid among the false ones, and Harry called it up and let it into the plausible empty room at the front of his mind, 10,000 times, until it found nothing. Until the most skilled reader the world had ever recorded could stand in the bright, ordinary parlor he had built and look at the dull thoughts of a feather-levitating child, and walk out again convinced there was no second floor. He suspected he would meet such a reader up the stairs. He had no face for the suspicion yet, only a shape, someone old and kind and curious, someone who collected children the way Harry had once collected unexplained events, someone who would smile down at an orphan and mean it and weigh him in the same breath. The world did not fold an enemy into an infant's skull and then leave the infant lying in a cupboard for 10 years by accident. Somebody had done the leaving. Somebody had known about the cupboard and written it into an address and waited. A person did not have to be cruel to be dangerous. The cartographer had been neither, and had still nearly hollowed him out with nothing but generosity and time. The grandfather up the stairs, whoever he proved to be, would be grandfatherly and would have steel under it, and Harry intended to give him exactly one thing to look at, which was a boy, and to keep the mansion dark behind the parlor, and to learn the old kind dangerous man the way he had learned the braided 7. By losing nothing, by parrying nothing, by waiting for the half-second the form had never been built to survive. The note faded to a whisper, and the whisper faded to the memory of a whisper, And then, for the first time since a struck bell on a forgotten night, the hall was silent, the true silence, the absence of sound, the comfortable madness the cartographer had warned him about 1,000 years and 11 days ago, and the silence lasted exactly one heartbeat, and then the stairs were there. They came up out of the floor where they had gone down, 412 of them, and the silver light pooled on the lowest step like an invitation, and Harry looked at them for a while because a man does not rush the last thing. Then he climbed. He did not count the stairs. He had nothing left to prove to the dark, and the dark, its work finished, had nothing left to read. At the top the hearthstone stood open as he had left it a millennium and a moment ago, and beyond it the gray light of a storm finally breaking, and the smell of the sea, the real sea, salt and rot and weather, the first outside air to reach him in 1,000 years, and it went down the long corridor of the house in his mind, and every door in the house answered at once, even the thick one, even the bright new front room. The whole mansion ringing with the smell of a world that had spent one night while he spent everything. He stepped up through the hearth and the stone settled shut behind him, seamless, mortared, a hearth that had never moved and never would again, and he stood in the rotting shack on the rock and looked at the sleeping shapes of his family who had not stirred, who had spent the night asleep while he spent it becoming the most dangerous thing in the British Isles, and he felt, allowing himself the one named feeling he would permit the whole long night. Something that was not quite grief and not quite tenderness but stood where both would stand, looking at Dudley's slack face and Vernon's open mouth and the broken watch still ticking on a fat wrist toward a dawn it would reach in minutes. They had not changed. That was the wonder of it, larger than the bell, larger than the fold. He had changed past every measure a tongue could hold, and they had not changed at all, and the gap between those two facts was the country he was going to have to live in now, alone, the way he had lived in the cupboard, the way he had lived in the hall, the unobserved variable, except that now the variable was not small. Now the variable could light a candle that no one had handed him a wand to light, and could die without flinching, and could read the fold in his own skull, and could fold a mind down into a child and wear it like a coat. Far off across the heaving water a light was coming. Not the dawn was behind him, gray in the east through the broken window. This light moved, low and yellow and bobbing, a lantern in a boat, crossing the sea toward the rock with the steady purpose of a thing that has been sent. Harry watched it come and did the arithmetic, the first arithmetic he had done in the world above in 1,000 years, and it came out clean and simple and almost funny. The hidden chapter, having waited a fortnight for the letters and 1,000 years for him, was about to knock on the door in person, and did not know, could not know, that the child it had come to collect had already grown older than the order that built the chamber and the enemy folded in his skull, and quite possibly the grandfatherly probing thing that had sent the lantern across the sea. The boat struck the rock, heavy feet found the boards. And a fist the size of a dinner plate hammered on the door of the shack, boom, loud enough to wake the dead and very nearly loud enough to wake Vernon, and Harry Potter arranged his 1,000-year-old face into the open, startled, hopeful expression of a boy who has been waiting his whole short life to be told he is special, and stepped forward, light on his feet, 11 years old and every inch a careless eye could measure, to let the world back in. Chapter 2 and Chapter 3. The boy who outwaited a wand. The door came off its hinges, the way a thing comes off its hinges when something very large has decided the hinges are not the point, and the storm came in, and behind the storm came the largest person Harry had ever seen, which was a category that had survived 1,000 years intact because the chamber had held no people in it at all. Harry looked up at him with an expression he had practiced 10,000 times in the bright front room of his mind, the open, hopeful, startled face of a child who has been waiting his whole short life to be told he is special, and underneath the face the vast dark mansion stood quiet and read the giant the way it read everything. Kind. That was the first reading, and the readings did not lie to him because he had spent a millennium teaching them not to. Kind all the way down, kind in the bone, a man whose every motion was an apology for the size of him, who had broken a door and now stood holding the pieces as though to put them back. Loyal next, and loyal to a particular person because the loyalty had a direction, a weight that leaned toward someone not in the room, the way a compass leans, and a key. Whatever else the giant was, he was a thing that had been sent, a key turned in a lock by a hand somewhere across the sea, and the hand had chosen a key that loved the door it was opening, which told Harry more about the hand than the giant could have told him in a year. Harry Potter, the giant said, and his voice cracked down the middle on the second word, and his small black eyes were wet. Last time I saw you, you was only a baby. You look a lot like your dad, but ye have got your mum's eyes. A normal child would have asked who he was. Harry asked it because Harry was, for the foreseeable future, going to be a normal child as a full-time occupation, and the first rule of the occupation was that he must never know a thing before he was told it. Who are you? He said, and put a wobble in it, and hated the wobble a little, the way a craftsman hates a join that shows, even a good one. Rubeus Hagrid, said the giant, keeper of keys and grounds at Hogwarts. He said the name of the school the way other men said the name of a god, and Harry catalogued the reverence and set it beside the leaning loyalty, and understood that the hand across the sea and the school were the same direction on the compass. Yale know all about Hogwarts, o' course. I don't, Harry said truthfully, because he had decided early that he would lie only when lying bought something, and the truth here bought more. It bought Hagrid the pleasure of telling, and a man who has had the pleasure of telling you a thing will tell you 10 more before he thinks to wonder why you let him. What followed was the conversation the whole wizarding world apparently believed it was having with Harry Potter for the first time, and Harry conducted his half of it with the care of a man crossing a frozen river on a path he cannot see. He was a wizard. He said he had been left with the Dursleys as a baby. He let his face do something quiet at that, not because he needed to perform it, but because the quiet was real, and he had learned long ago that the cheapest disguise is a true feeling shown at the right moment. His parents had not died in a car crash. Here Vernon, who had heaved himself awake and into the doorway with a rifle that Hagrid bent into a knot without looking at it, made the mistake of saying the word car crash aloud, and Harry watched a kind man become briefly terrible, and filed the demonstration where it belonged, which was not away but close at hand, because a man who loved a door and could not a rifle was a man worth understanding precisely. A car crash, said Hagrid very low, killed Lily and James Potter. We had say summat, muttered Petunia from the shadows, and that was the moment Harry learned the most useful single fact of the night, which was that his aunt had known, not suspected, known. Had been told by someone the shape of what her sister was and what had killed her, and had chosen the cupboard and the car crash and the long flat denial, and Harry adjusted his entire model of the woman who had raised him in the space of a held breath, and felt the adjustment settle into place with the small click of a thing that had been waiting years to be true. Then Hagrid said the name. He said it the way you confess to a wound. Voldemort and flinched at his own mouth, and around the word the air in the broken shack did a thing that no one else in the room could have measured, and Harry measured exactly. A faint pull, a leaning, a fold in his own skull turning over in its long sleep at the sound of a name it knew. The sliver of borrowed attention behind his scar, the thing he had learned on the highest ring of the chamber and chosen not to remove, stirred and tasted the name and settled back, and Harry kept the open, hopeful, startled face nailed in place over the top of the stir and said, Vol, sorry, who? And let Hagrid spell it out, and learned, as a boy learns, the official version of the night that had folded an enemy into his head. A dark wizard, the worst there had been, a war, his parents dead defending him, the curse that should have killed him turned aside, the scar, the boy who lived. It was a good story. Harry could see the shape of the true one underneath it, the way he could see the grammar under a spell, and the true one had a hole in it exactly the size of the question no one in the wizarding world had apparently ever thought to ask out loud, which was, where did it go? A curse that should have killed an infant did not, and the caster was destroyed, vanished, gone but not dead. Hagrid was careful on the point, not dead, hiding, weak, waiting. Waiting where? Harry knew where. Harry had spent 1,000 years learning the answer to where, and the answer was folded in behind his own eyes, sleeping, and he was not going to say so to a kind man holding a broken door, because a card not yet played is worth more than a card thrown down to win a hand that does not matter. I'm not special, Harry said, which was the largest lie he would tell that night and the one Hagrid least believed, and the disbelief was the point. Let them all think he was protesting from modesty. Modesty was a coat that fit a hero, and a hero was a thing they wanted to see, and a thing people want to see is a thing they will see whether or not you provide it. So the cheapest move was to wear the coat and let them dress him in their own story and keep the real one in the dark behind the parlor. They left in the morning when the storm had blown itself out and the dawn lay gray and clean on the heaving water, and Harry did not look back at the shack, because the door he kept was not in the shack, and a man does not waste his looking back on rooms that were never his. Hagrid talked the whole way to the mainland, because Hagrid talked the way rivers run, downhill and without effort, and Harry let him, because a talking man is a man teaching you the shape of his world for free. Thing Hagrid kept circling back to, the way a compass keeps finding north, was a name, and the name was Albus Dumbledore. Greatest wizard alive, Hagrid said, with the boat rocking under them and the gulls wheeling. Headmaster o' Hogwarts, only one you know who was ever scared of, and that's the truth. Defeated the dark wizard Grindelwald back in 45, sorted out the 12 uses o' dragon's blood, the lot. Great man Dumbledore, great man. He glanced down, suddenly shy of his own warmth. It was him put ye with your aunt and uncle, ye know. After, he'll have had his reasons, always does. Ye don, questioned Dumbledore. Harry looked at the grey water and arranged the new piece on the board behind the parlor, and the piece was the largest yet, because it had a name now and a face he could find later and a habit he could already feel the edges of. The hand across the sea was Albus Dumbledore, the hand that had known about the cupboard and written it into an address. The hand that had taken a marked infant, an infant with an enemy folded into its skull, and set it down in a house that hated it, and left it there for 10 years and called the leaving protection and had reasons, always had reasons, and was not to be questioned. Harry did not hate him for it. Hatred was a bet placed before the cards were turned, and besides, the cartographer had nearly hollowed him out with nothing but reasons and kindness, and Harry had learned in the chamber that the most dangerous person in any hall is the benevolent one with a plan, because cruelty announces itself and benevolence does not. He did not hate Dumbledore. He simply understood, sitting in a rocking boat with an ice cream cone he had not been given yet still ahead of him in the day, that he had found the player at last, and that the player was kind and patient and powerful and convinced of his own reasons, and that this made him exactly the sort of opponent 1,000 years had taught Harry to respect and never ever to trust. "What's he like?" Harry asked, a boy curious about a hero. "Ye'll see," said Hagrid fondly, twinkly. "Looks at ye like he can see straight through ye." "Can he?" Harry asked and made it sound like wonder. "Reckon he sees more'n most," said Hagrid, which was the most useful warning anyone would give Harry all year, delivered by a kind man who thought he was paying his headmaster a compliment. London had not changed, which struck Harry as the strangest fact of the day, and then on reflection the least strange, because of course London had not changed. It had been one night. The buses ran. The people hurried with their heads down in the manner of the unobserved, and Harry, who had been the unobserved variable for 10 years and then for 10 centuries, walked among them with a millennium behind his eyes and a giant beside him, and no one looked twice, and he found that he had missed it, the particular safety of being no one in a crowd, the safety the chamber could not give because the chamber had no crowd. Then Hagrid steered him off a busy street into a dim little pub that the busy street did not appear to be able to see, and the safety ended, because inside the leaky cauldron every head turned, and Harry Potter learned in the space of one threshold what it was to be the most looked-at person in a world. It came at him as a pressure, a dozen, 2 dozen faces lighting with the same recognition, the same hush, the same surge forward, and an ancient instinct that had kept him alive against the braided 7 measured the room for threat before his front-room face had finished arranging its delight. No threat, only hunger, the specific hunger of people for a story they have loved from far away and now find standing in a pub in a too-big coat. They shook his hand. They wept. A pale young man in a turban hung back near the wall, and Harry's attention went to him the way water goes to the lowest point in a floor, because the pale young man was the one thing in the room that did not fit the hunger, and Harry would have gone on reading him then if Hagrid had not steered him forward into the crowd, and so Harry shelved the turban gently where he could reach it and shook the hands and said the small, grateful nothings a hero says, and watched himself become in real time. In 2 dozen pairs of shining eyes, a thing that had nothing to do with him. He understood it as a tool and a trap at once, the way he understood most things. The fame was a tool because a looked-at child can hide a great deal in plain sight. The world that has decided who you are will explain away almost anything you do as part of the story it already owns. The fame was a trap because the same world would come, sooner or later, to collect on the story, to demand that the child be the boy, and a man who lets a crowd write him will one day be asked to die for the draft. Harry took the tool. He left the trap where it lay. And when the turbaned young man was finally pressed forward and introduced as Professor Quirrell, who would be teaching defense against the dark arts, Harry shook a cold, trembling hand and felt the fold behind his scar come fully awake. It was the most information he had received since the chamber, and it arrived in less than a second, and he showed none of it. The thing behind his scar tasted the air around Quirrell and knew it, the way a man knows his own handwriting in another man's letter. There was a fold near Quirrell too, not in his skull, higher. Under the turban, wrapped close, a second attention folded in against the first, sleeping less deeply than the sliver in Harry's head, hungrier, nearer to waking, a guest that had moved into the house and begun, slowly, to eat the host. Harry held the cold hand the regulation moment and stammered something back at the stammering professor and read, under the stutter, the particular exhaustion of a man being eaten, and understood that the dark wizard who was not dead and was hiding and weak and waiting had found at last a door to wait behind, and had ridden it into the same pub as the child he had marked on the same morning by an arrangement too neat to be chance. Somebody was moving pieces. Harry had suspected it of the grandfather across the sea. He revised the suspicion now into something larger and colder. 2 pieces had been brought to the same square on the same day, the marked child and the hidden enemy, and the board was the school they were all leaning toward, and a man did not have to see the player to know a game was on. He let go of Quirrell's hand. He let his face stay a boy's. And behind the parlor in the dark, the mansion noted the position of every piece it had been shown and began, without hurry, to play. Diagon Alley opened behind the pub the way the chamber had opened beneath the hearth, a small impossible door onto a larger impossible world, and Harry walked into it at a giant's side and let his eyes be a child's eyes, wide, because the wideness cost nothing and bought goodwill. The street was a river of robes and cauldrons and owls, and the particular controlled chaos of a place where the laws he had spent 1,000 years learning were treated as casually as weather. He saw a dozen spells thrown in the first minute, every one of them the brutal abbreviation the cartographer had described, Lumos and Wingardium, and a witch mending a cracked window with a word, and not one wizard on the whole bright street suspected that the words were walls they were leaning on rather than commands they were giving. He could have lit the entire alley without a syllable. He bought an ice cream instead because Hagrid wanted to buy him one, and a man who has been alone for 1,000 years does not refuse the second kind person to offer him a thing in a single morning. What struck him, walking the alley, was not the magic but the carelessness of it, the way a whole civilization had built itself on powers it no longer troubled to understand. A witch resealed a cracked cauldron with a word, and never once wondered what the word was leaning on. A wizard charmed a stack of ledgers to file themselves, and would have been astonished to learn that the charm was a single bullet syllable of a sentence 10,000 words long. Harry had spent 1,000 years on the grammar these people abbreviated without a thought, and walking among them was like walking among heirs who had inherited a cathedral and used it as a barn, hanging their washing from the flying buttresses, perfectly happy, perfectly blind. He did not despise them for it. 1,000 years had burned the despising out of him, along with most other expensive feelings. But he understood, threading the bright, careless crowd with an ice cream melting over his knuckles, that the gap between himself and the whole of Wizarding Britain was not a gap of power, which could be hidden, but a gap of seeing which could not, because he could not unsee the cathedral once he had read it, and they could not see it at all. And a person who notices the thing no one else notices will be alone in any crowd, however bright, however kind. Gringotts was the first place that made him pay attention as an equal rather than an actor. He felt it from the steps before they passed the burnished doors, before the goblin in scarlet and gold bowed them through, the wards. Not the polite domestic wards of the alley, the leaning word magic of shopkeepers, but old work, deep work, layered and patient and savage, a grammar of protection written by hands that did not love and did not forgive and had had a very long time to practice. Harry walked into the marble hall and read the wards the way another visitor read the inscription over the door, and the inscription over the door, which warned thieves that they would find more than treasure waiting, was the only honest advertisement he had seen all day. The goblins had built like the horologers built, for keeps, for centuries, against everything. He respected it. He let none of the respect show, because an 11-year-old does not respect a bank. An 11-year-old is bored by a bank, and so Harry was bored by a bank and yawned, and was given a small brass key by Hagrid that opened a vault with more gold in it than the Dursleys had earned in his lifetime. His gold, his parents' gold, left for him, waiting, like the letters, like the chamber, like everything. He filled a bag and asked no questions about the amount, because a hero does not count his gold in front of the one who guards it, and because he had learned the value of seeming not to count. But he counted. And he noticed on the long, rattling cart ride deeper into the earth that Hagrid had a second errand, a small, grubby package taken from a vault numbered 713 that opened not with a key but with a goblin's long finger drawn down its door, and that Hagrid put the package inside his coat with the particular casualness of a man who has been told to be casual, and said, "Hogwarts business." Very secret, which was the least secret thing anyone had said all day, because a secret announced is a secret offered, and Harry took the offer, weighed the package's wrapped shape and the depth of the vault and the savagery of the wards around it, and understood that something small and valuable and dangerous had just been moved from the safest place in the wizarding world to a school full of children, on the orders of the hand across the sea. On the same morning, the marked child and the hidden enemy had been brought to the same pub, the board filled in another square. Harry ate the rest of his ice cream and let his feet swing off the edge of the cart like a child's, and did not say that he could feel even through the coat that the package hummed with the same deep old grammar as the vault, a made thing, a worked thing, a thing somebody powerful had spent a great deal of themselves to create. He had a guess at what it was. He kept the guess in the dark with the rest. Madame Malkin's was a small bright shop full of pins, and Hagrid, who did not fit through the door and did not pretend otherwise, went off to steady his nerves with something strong while Harry was fitted. And so Harry stood on a stool to have his length taken alone, next to another boy being fitted on the next stool, a boy with a pale pointed face and white blonde hair and the particular boredom of a child who has never once in his life been the unobserved variable. "Hello," the pale child drawled. "Hogwarts too, yes," said Harry. "My father's next door buying my books and my mother's up the street looking at wands," his neighbor said in the voice of a person reading a list of his own assets. "Then I'm going to drag them off to look at racing brooms. I don't see why first years can't have their own. I think I'll bully father into getting me one and smuggle it in somehow." He looked Harry over, taking in the too big coat, and made a small adjustment to his manner downward. "Have you got your own broom?" "No," said Harry, and watched his neighbor decide he was no one and let him, because being decided to be no one was the oldest and most comfortable coat Harry owned. The pale child talked. Harry let him, the way he had let Hagrid, and read him while he talked, and the reading was quick and a little sad. There was a script running under the drawl, a script he had been handed by someone he loved and feared, full of words like the right sort in our kind and they really shouldn't let the others in. And he recited it with the fluency of a child who has never been allowed to doubt it and the faint underlying anxiety of a child who suspects, somewhere below the fluency, that he's being watched for errors even now, even here, even by a shop assistant with a mouthful of pins. He was not cruel. He had been folded into a shape by a hand that loved him, the way Harry had been folded by a hand that did not, and the shapes were different but the folding was the same, and Harry felt for him a flat, distant thing that was not quite pity, because pity was a feeling for people you had given up on, and he was 11 and not yet finished. I suppose his sort, the pale child said, nodding at the window where Hagrid stood beaming in with 2 ice creams because he could not bear that Harry should be inside without one, is all right if you have to, but really, a servant. He's my friend, said Harry mildly, which was true, and which he had decided in the same breath was true, because a man who has been alone for 1,000 years does not let a rehearsed child talk him out of the second kind person to buy him an ice cream in a single day. Something flickered in the pale face, the small recalculation of a boy who has misjudged the table he is at, and then the drawl resumed, smoother, recovering, and the pale child held out a hand at the end of the fitting and said his name, Draco Malfoy, with the small pause that expected the name to do work. It did work, but not the work it expected. Harry had read the name on a vault ledger of old families in the chamber's lower shelves, one of a dozen lines that had backed the losing side of a war and walked away rich, and he set the name beside the script and the anxiety and the loving, fearful hand, and understood the whole house in a sentence. He did not give his own name. He let Madame Malkin say, "That's you done, dear," and stepped off the stool, and Draco Malfoy went out into the alley to be wealthy, never knowing he had sat for 10 minutes beside the one boy in the wizarding world who had already, in another life, outlived his entire family tree. They came at last to Ollivander's, and Ollivander's was where Harry had to decide how good at this he was willing to be seen to be. The shop was narrow and dim and smelled of dust and secrets, and the secrets were real, which was rare. Most secrets Harry had found were just facts that had not yet bored anyone enough to be told. Garrick Ollivander came forward out of the shelves like a pale moon rising, with eyes that were the first eyes Harry had met all day that he respected on contact, because they were measuring eyes, a craftsman's eyes, and a craftsman is the most dangerous kind of observer, because a craftsman has spent his life learning to see the one true line under the 10,000 false ones. Ollivander was a reader of wands, which meant a reader of the wizard's wands chose, which meant Harry was standing in the one shop in Diagon Alley where the dull, bright parlor at the front of his mind might not be enough. "I wondered when I would be seeing you, Mr. Potter," said Ollivander softly, and began. The fitting was a duel, and only one of them knew it. Ollivander brought wand after wand, and Harry took them and waved them and let each one do the small wrong thing it did, a vase shattering, a drawer flying out because the wands were reading him too and finding, most of them, a child, which was what Harry was showing them, and a wand cannot bond with a costume. This was the danger he had not fully reckoned. A wand chose the wizard, the whole wizard, the dark mansion, and not only the bright parlor, and Harry could not show a wand a child and expect a true match, but he could not show the shop a true match without showing Ollivander the size of the thing the wand had matched. He walked the line. He let the wands taste enough of him to reject him honestly, the way they would reject any boy whose wand had not yet come, and he kept the mansion shuttered, and Ollivander's measuring eyes grew brighter with every failure, because Ollivander had fitted wands for 100 years, and 100 years had taught him that a difficult fitting means a remarkable wizard, and the eyes were beginning to wonder just how remarkable. "Tricky customer, eh?" murmured Ollivander. "Not to worry. We shall find the perfect match here somewhere." And then his hands paused over the shelves and went, with the surety of a man drawn rather than choosing, to a particular box, and he came back slower than he had gone and said, "I wonder," and gave Harry a wand of holly, 11 inches, supple with a core, he said, of phoenix feather. Harry took it, and the wand knew him, and he let it. That was the decision, made in the half-second between the wood meeting his fingers and the world deciding what would happen next, and he made it the way he had learned to make decisions in the chamber, fully, without flinching, weighing the cost both ways. He could shutter the mansion and give the wand only the parlor and walk out with a tool that half-fit him forever, safe and underpowered, and a liar's wand. Or he could open the door a single inch, let the holly and the feather taste the smallest true edge of what he was, take a wand that actually matched him, and pay for it in whatever Ollivander's measuring eyes made of the warmth and wind and light that a true match throws. He opened the door an inch. Warmth ran up his arm like a swallow of something strong, and red and gold sparks fell from the end of the wand and lit the dim shop like a small contained dawn, and Hagrid cheered, and Harry let his front-room face flood with a boy's pure delight, which was easy, because under the delight a millennium-old thing was quietly satisfied to hold at last, a focus worthy of being thrown away, and the two delights wore the same face, his own. Ollivander did not cheer. Ollivander went very still, and his measuring eyes did not leave Harry, and when he spoke his voice had dropped the salesman's warmth entirely. "Curious," he said, "curious." "Sorry," said Harry, a boy, "but what's curious? I remember every wand I have ever sold, Mr. Potter, every one. It so happens that the phoenix whose tail feather sits in your wand gave another feather, just one other. It is very curious that you should be destined for this wand when its brother gave you that scar." And there it was, laid on the dusty counter between them, the whole of it, the thing Harry had learned on the highest ring of the chamber, spoken aloud in a wand shop by a man who did not know what he was saying. That the holly in his hand was sister to the yew that had folded the enemy into his skull, that the same bird had given itself to the hunter and the hunted, that the board he had been reading all day went deeper and older than the grandfather across the sea, down into a place where birds and curses and orphans were arranged into patterns by hands that perhaps no living wizard could see. Harry felt the fold behind his scar turn over once more, recognizing across a dim shop the kin of the wood that had made it. He held the wand of holly steady. He did not let it tremble. He arranged his thousand-year-old face into the wide, unguarded look of a boy hearing for the first time that his scar and his wand were two halves of one terrible coincidence, and he said the thing a child would say, which was nothing, which was only to look at the wand and then at the old craftsman with a question he was careful not to be able to ask. "I think," said Ollivander, watching him with those bright measuring eyes, "that we must expect great things from you, Mr. Potter." After all, he who must not be named did great things. Terrible, yes, but great. A lesser concealment would have flinched at the comparison. Harry did not flinch, because flinching was a thing he had worn out at a chalk line 1,000 years deep, and instead he let his boy's face show the small, uncomplicated discomfort of a child who has been compared to a murderer and does not like it, which was the correct and disarming response, and which also happened to be a sliver of the truth, because Harry did not, in fact, like it. He paid for the wand, 7 galleons. He counted them out slowly, fumbling one, a child with new money, and Ollivander took the gold and bowed him from the shop, and the measuring eyes followed him all the way to the door, and Harry felt them on his back like a hand and understood that he had been seen, not through, but at that the old craftsman had registered the difficulty of the fitting and the size of the spark and the steadiness of a child who should have trembled, and had filed it, the way Harry filed things, close at hand, for later. One witness who suspected, the first of many. He could not prevent them. He could only make sure that what each of them suspected was small enough to carry alone and strange enough to share with no one without sounding mad, and Ollivander, bless his measuring eyes, would sound very mad indeed if he ever tried to explain that the Potter boy had felt, for 1/2 second over a wand, 1,000 years old. At Flourish and Blot's Harry did the cleverest shopping of the day, and no one watching would have called it clever, because it looked like a boy who could not stop buying books. He bought the course books, the small, thin, abbreviated course books, and standing among the towering shelves he had to manage his own face, because the curriculum was so slight it was almost touching. A year of feather floating and match to needle laid out as though it were the sum of magic, when he had read 400 rings of a hall larger than the rock that held it. A standard book of spells, grade 1. He had been grade 1 for 40 years before he lit a candle. But he bought them, and then he bought more, a great armful more, history and theory, and a fat, dull volume on the properties of magical wards and another on the lives of famous duelists, and Hagrid laughed and said he'd be top of the class, and Harry let himself be a boy who loved books too much, because that was precisely the child he needed the world to file him as. This was the move, and it was a concealment move, and it was the most important purchase of his life after a holly wand. A boy who has been seen buying every book in the shop has an answer ready for every impossible thing he will ever later be caught knowing. Where did you learn that? I read it. Where did you read it? A book. I read so many, I can't recall which. He was not building a library. He was building an alibi, a thick paper wall between the things he would do and the place he had learned to do them, so that when the mansion behind the parlor reached out, once or twice a term, to do a thing no first year should be able to do, there would always be a book on his shelf that a kind, credulous world could decide he must have got it from. He carried the armful to the counter and counted out the gold slowly, fumbling, a child overwhelmed, and bought himself, for a fistful of galleons, the right to be a prodigy instead of a mystery for the next 7 years. Outside, the alley had gone gold with afternoon, and Hagrid bought him an owl snow white, because Hagrid could not bear that the day end without a gift large enough to match what he felt and could not say, and Harry took the owl and meant the thank you, because the owl was a living thing that would look at him and not at the boy who lived, and a man who has been alone for 1,000 years counts a creature that will look at the real him as a wealth past gold. He named her later. For now he carried her cage through the thinning crowd and let Hagrid steer him toward the pub and the train and the ordinary world, and he did the day's arithmetic one last time, the way he had once done arithmetic on a cold floor while a watch ticked toward midnight. He had been collected, as promised, by a key who loved its lock. He had been shown a hidden enemy folded into a stammering man, and a guarded thing moved from a deep vault to a school, and a wand that was the sister of the wood that had marked him, and he had been compared by a craftsman with the truest eyes in the alley to the very thing waiting under the turban. None of it was chance. All of it lay toward Hogwarts, toward the hand across the sea, toward a game whose player he had not yet seen, and whose board he was being walked across in a too-big coat with an ice cream and an owl. A lesser boy would have been frightened, a greater one might have been eager. Harry was neither, because fright and eagerness were both bets placed before the cards were turned, and he had 1,000 years of patience and a wand worthy of being set down in a fold in his skull that knew the enemy's name, and he intended to walk onto the board exactly as he had walked down 400 stairs, alone, unhurried, counting the unobserved variable that was no longer small. "All rig, Harry," Hagrid rumbled, mistaking the quiet for nerves, as kind men do. "Ye have gone all quiet. It's a lot to take in, I know, but ye'll be grand at Hogwarts, juice grand, everyone'll be looking at ye." "I know," said Harry, and let his face be rueful, a boy's, and meant something the giant would never guess. Everyone would be looking at him. That was the trouble and the cover and the game. He settled the owl's cage against his hip and walked on into the gold light with a millennium behind his eyes, 11 years old in every inch a careless eye could measure, and not one eye in the whole bright alley careful enough to measure the rest. That night, in a small, clean room above the leaky cauldron, with Hagrid snoring through the wall like distant weather and the noise of an unhidden London coming faint through the glass, Harry sat on the bed and let the front room face come off for the first time since a fist had taken a door off its hinges, and was for an hour in a room with a window and a door and no one watching, simply old. The owl watched him. He had set her cage on the sill and opened it, and she had not flown, only turned her head and regarded him with round, unhurried eyes, and he found that he could not look away from her, because she was looking at him and not at the boy who lived, not at a story, not at a hero or a comparison or a piece on a board. She looked at the thing in the bed, the actual thing, a small body with 1,000 years folded down inside it, and she did not flinch from what she saw, because she could not read it, because she was an owl, and Harry discovered that the gaze of a creature that cannot be deceived, because it cannot be told a story, was the closest thing to honest company he had been offered since a worn light went out in a silver hall. He named her then. He had bought a history of magic that afternoon, thick and self-important, and somewhere in its early pages, a medieval witch named Hedwig had done something kind and been burned for it, and he gave the name to the owl, partly because it pleased him and partly because a hero with a sentimental owl was a more believable hero than one without, and the two reasons wore the same name, Hedwig, and he did not trouble to separate them. He went to the door at the end of the long corridor before he slept. He did not open it. He laid a hand against it in the dark of his own skull, the way the cartographer had taught him, and felt the warmth come through the imagined oak, still there, still his, still refusing, and he understood with the day's whole weight behind it why he had kept this particular thing and no other. He had chosen on the first night the memory of being counted, the green ink that had seen the cupboard and written it down. And today the world had counted him too much, 24 pairs of shining eyes in a pub, a craftsman with measuring eyes, a kind giant weeping, an old player across the sea who had counted him most carefully of all and set him in a cupboard and waited. They had all counted the boy who lived, not one of them had counted the child underneath. The door at the end of the corridor held the difference between the two, and Harry pressed his hand to it until the warmth answered, and then he let the front room face settle back over the dark mansion, and lay down, 11 years old in every inch a careless eye could measure, and slept the shallow, ready sleep of a thing that had taught itself, 1,000 years ago, never to be caught unguarded by a morning. Chapter 3 and Chapter 4. What the Hat heard. The barrier between platforms 9 and 10 looked solid and was not, and Harry walked through it a half-step behind a family of redheads because the cheapest way to learn a secret is to follow someone who already knows it. He had found them by listening. A plump woman herding children through the crush of King's Cross had said the word muggles too loudly, the way the wizarding world said everything too loudly, secure in a contempt that was also a kind of blindness, and Harry had drifted into their wake and let the youngest boy show him, without meaning to, exactly how a person leaned into a brick wall and came out the other side onto a scarlet engine breathing steam under a wrought iron arch. He thanked their mother. He found a compartment. And the youngest redhead, having nowhere better to sit because his brothers had abandoned him for more interesting carriages, slid the door open and asked if he could, and Harry said yes, and that was how he acquired Ron Weasley, who would turn out to be one of the 2 people in the world who could feel the truth about Harry without ever once being able to say it. Ron was easy in the way the chamber had never been easy, and Harry had 1,000 years of reasons to value easy. The conversation cost nothing and gave a map, the houses, the families, the long Weasley line of brothers, the casual encyclopedic knowledge of the wizarding world that Harry needed and could not be seen to lack. Harry traded for it with the one currency he had in surplus, which was attention, real attention, the undivided regard of a person who had spent a millennium learning to listen to silence and found a freckled boy talking about chess almost unbearably rich by comparison. Ron noticed the attention. People always noticed the attention because almost no one ever gave it, and Ron, who was the sixth of seven and accustomed to being the least watched thing in any room, bloomed under it the way Hagrid had bloomed, and Harry felt the old familiar guilt of the watcher who is loved for watching and means it and benefits from it both at once. Then Ron's eyes went to the scar, the way everyone's eyes went to the scar, and Harry let him look, and Ron said, "So can you do stuff already?" And there it was, the first test of the day, offered by a friendly boy with a smudge on his nose. "A bit," Harry said. "I bought a lot of books." He pulled out a wand, the holly wand, and did the smallest true thing he allowed himself in company, which was nothing, a flick, a muttered nonsense rhyme he had read in Ron's own attempt a moment before, and Scabbers the rat stayed resolutely gray and asleep. And Harry let the spell fail openly, a beginner's misfire, and Ron laughed and said his brothers had sold him a dud spell, and the danger past, diffused not by hiding power but by performing its absence. This was the craft. A man who never failed was a mystery. A man who failed in the ordinary places and succeeded only where a book could be blamed was a prodigy, and a prodigy was a thing the world had a comfortable shelf for. Harry put the wand away and let Ron teach him a card game, and lost twice on purpose and won the third because winning every time was suspicious, and losing every time was sad, and a person who is sad is a person people look at, and Harry had spent his whole life and his whole death learning not to be looked at. The compartment door opened again on a girl with a great deal of brown hair and a voice already certain of itself, hunting a lost toad on behalf of a boy too timid to hunt it himself, and Harry understood within one sentence that Hermione Granger was going to be the harder of the two. She was not harder because she was cleverer, though she was clever, the cleverest person Harry had met since the cartographer and the only living one. She was harder because her cleverness ran on a particular engine, the engine of a child who has been right her whole life and punished for it, who has learned that the world rewards the appearance of knowing and so has armored herself in knowing until the armor and the girl are difficult to tell apart, and Harry recognized the engine on contact because it was a cousin of his own. He had armored himself in not being seen. She had armored herself in being unanswerable. And a person armored in being unanswerable is a person who cannot stop testing the people around her to find out whether they, too, will fail to answer and prove her loneliness correct one more time. She tested Harry. She rattled off that she had read about him, that he was in books, modern history, and watched his face for the bloom of vanity she expected, and Harry gave her instead a small rueful shrug, the shrug of a person who finds his own fame embarrassing, and watched her file the data with a faint frown because the data did not fit, because he was supposed to either preen or cringe and had done a third thing she had no category for, which was to be unbothered. "You should change into your robes," she told them both, in the voice of a person who needs the last word because she has learned that the last word is the only thing no one can take. "I expect we'll be there soon." And she left, and Ron made a face, and Harry did not make a face because he had seen under the bossiness the specific brittle hope of a girl who had announced to a train full of strangers that she would be the best and was privately terrified that being the best would turn out, as it always had, to win her nothing she actually wanted. He had not decided yet what to do about Hermione Granger. He filed her the way he filed things close at hand. She was going to notice him. She was built to notice. The only question was what she would notice and how small he could keep it. The castle came on them after dark, across a black lake, and it was the first thing Harry had seen in the wizarding world that he looked at with something other than performance. Hogwarts was old the way the chamber was old, and alive the way the chamber had been alive, and as the little boat slid toward it under a cliff crowned with towers and 1,000 lit windows, Harry read the place the way he had read the wards of Gringotts, and what he read silenced even the front room of his mind. The castle was a-working. Not a building with magic in it, but a building made of magic, 1,000 years of it, layered and grown and patched and improvised, the deep deliberate grammar of the founders overwritten by 10 centuries of headmasters and accidents, and the slow sentient settling of a place that had been loved and feared by 40 generations of children, until it had woken up, a little the way the chamber's walls had been awake. He could feel it deciding things. He could feel it watching the boats with the mild ancient interest the carved stairs had turned on him, weighing the new arrivals, and he had the sudden certainty, which 1,000 years had taught him to trust, that the castle would know him for what he was long before any human in it did, because the castle was the only other thing in Scotland his own age and like recognizes like. "Yale like it," Hagrid called back from the lead boat, mistaking Harry's stillness again. "Everyone likes it." Harry did like it. That was the trouble he was beginning to notice, the same trouble the owl had started, that he kept being offered things he could not afford to want, an owl that looked at the real him, a freckled boy who bloomed, a castle his own age. He had built the door in his mind to hold one thing safe from the years, and the years were over, and now the world was full of things sliding toward him across dark water, and a man who has trained for 1,000 years to need nothing was discovering on his first night that the training had a flaw, and the flaw was that he had never stopped wanting to be counted, and the world up the stairs was full of counters. The great hall swallowed them in candlelight and a ceiling that was not a ceiling but the sky, and at the front on a stool sat a hat. Harry knew it for what it was before Professor McGonagall explained, because the hat was the second thing in the castle his own age, and it was awake, fully awake, more awake than the walls, an old patched ragged singing thing with 1,000 years of children's minds folded into its seams, and Harry looked at it across the hall and felt it, faintly, already, brushing the edges of the room, tasting the new crop. And he understood with a cold, clean certainty exactly what was about to happen and exactly how dangerous it was. The sorting hat was a Legilimen's. It went inside. That was its whole function, to enter a mind and read it and name its shape aloud to a hall full of witnesses, and in a few minutes it was going to be lowered onto a 1,000-year-old mansion behind an 11-year-old face, and unlike Ollivander, unlike Dumbledore, unlike anyone else Harry would meet, the hat could not be shown the parlor because the hat did not knock at the front door. The hat came in through the roof. He had a choice to make in the time it took the line of first years to shorten, and he made it the way he made everything, fully, weighing the cost both ways, and the cost both ways was bad. He could fight the hat. He had the strength. He could close the mansion so completely that the hat met a sealed stone and screamed Slytherin or Gryffindor at random out of frustration and moved on, and the price would be that the oldest sentient thing in the castle would know, beyond any doubt, that it had just been locked out of a child's head by something stronger than itself, and would say so, perhaps in its own time, to the one person who would understand. Or he could let it in. He could open the door and let a 1,000-year-old hat walk into a 1,000-year-old mind and trust, against all his training, that a thing that had kept 10 centuries of secrets could keep one more. Harry walked up to the stool when McGonagall called his name, into the hush that fell when the hall heard it, Potter, Harry Potter, and he sat, and the brim came down over his eyes, and he chose, in the dark, to let it in. The hat went still. It was the stillness of a diver who has jumped into what he believed was a pond and felt no bottom come up to meet his feet, the stillness of a thing that has done one job 100,000 times and met, on the 100,000th and first, a case the job was not built for. Harry felt it standing just inside the threshold of his mind, at the head of the long cold corridor, looking down its length at the doors and the doors and the doors receding into a dark that did not end, and he felt it understand, in the way that only another ancient thing could understand, what it was looking at. Well, said the hat in the privacy behind his eyes, and then said nothing for a while, which from a hat that opened every sorting with a song was its own kind of shout. Well, I have been doing this for 1,000 years, Mr. Potter, and I have just discovered that I am the younger of the two of us in this hat. How? Harry did not waste the moment on alarm, because alarm was a bet and he did not bet. There is a chamber, he answered, in the same silent place, offering the hat the truth, because the truth was the only coin a mind-reader could not be cheated with, and the offering itself was the move. A thing that cannot be lied to can still be told only what serves you. A night in it is 1,000 years. I found it before my letter, and I came out this morning. You are the first to know, because you are the first who cannot help knowing, and I am asking you, one old thing to another, to keep it. The hat was quiet, turning this over with the slow care of a creature that had spent a millennium learning that the loudest fact is rarely the important one. I have kept every secret ever poured into me, it said at last, 10 centuries of them. I have never told a single child's fear to a single soul, not the cruelties, not the cowardice, not the small black wishes they none of them know I saw. I am, Mr. Potter, the most discreet object in Britain. That is not your difficulty. A pause, dry, almost amused. Your difficulty is that I sort by speaking aloud, and I cannot speak aloud the word for what you are, because there is no house for it, and the hall is waiting, and you have made me, for the first time in 1,000 years, late. There is a deeper difficulty than that, Harry said, and let the hat feel it, because the hat would feel it anyway, and a thing volunteered is worth more than a thing found. He turned the hat's attention gently down the corridor to the thick door at the very end, not the one he kept his own treasure behind, but the small clumsy fold behind his scar, and let it look at the sliver of borrowed sleeping attention folded in against him, the thing that was not his, the thing that knew the name Hagrid had flinched at. He felt the hat recoil, the first ordinary reaction it had had. That, said the hat, very low, is a piece of the worst student I ever sorted. I know it. I sorted the whole of him once when he was a clever, hungry boy with a name he hated, and I have spent 50 years wishing I had had the courage to do otherwise. It is in you. It is asleep. Harry felt the hat draw back from the fold and turn its attention to him with something new in it, something that on a human face would have been the look a man gives another man across the body of a shared enemy. You know it is there. You have known longer than I have, and you have not removed it, though you plainly could. Why? Because the one who put it there will come looking, Harry said, for he is not dead, and you know he is not dead, and a wound he can feel is a wound he trusts, and a wound he trusts is a door I can watch him come through at a time of my choosing rather than his. He let the hat sit with the whole shape of it, the 1,000 years, the fold, the patience, the plan that was not yet a plan but a readiness. I did not come here to be a hero. I came here because the board is here, and the player is here, and the enemy is here, folded into a man in a turban, and I am going to take all the time I need, the way I took it in the chamber, and I am going to need a house that lets a marked boy hide in plain sight while he learns the shape of the trap. So, you have read me, you tell me, where does a thing like me go to be least seen? The hat considered him for the length of a held breath in a hall that had begun, faintly, to murmur at the delay, and when it answered it did so with the particular respect of one ancient thing conceding a point to another. You think like my old serpent's house, it said, the patience, the watching, the long cold plan. You would do well in Slytherin, and they would never know they were sheltering the one thing on earth that could unmake them all, and that would suit you, would it not, to hide among the cunning where cunning is expected and therefore invisible. The hat paused. But that is the obvious move, and you are not an obvious creature, and the obvious move would put you at the right hand of every child whose father serves the thing behind your scar, and they would court you, and you would have to spend your strength refusing them quietly for 7 years. No, I will do you the better turn. I will put you where no one will ever think to look for a long, cold, patient mind, because it is the house of the brash and the loud and the brave, and a watcher hidden among the watched is the oldest trick there is, and you taught it to me yourself just now without knowing. Harry felt the decision settle and felt the hat draw breath in the way a hat draws breath to make it public. One thing, said the hat only to him in the last half-second before the word. You kept a door at the end of the corridor. I did not look behind it, even I have manners, but I will tell you what I tell no one because you are the only student I have ever sorted who could understand it. I have lived 1,000 years on this shelf, awake, unable to move, reading children and forgetting nothing, and the only reason I have not gone the way your chamber warned you of, the way the discipline goes, is that I kept a door too. Mine has a song behind it. I sing it once a year and it keeps me a hat instead of a horror. Keep yours, Mr. Potter, whatever is behind it, keep it the way I keep mine, and we will both make it to year 2000 still ourselves. And then aloud to the whole waiting hall in a voice that cracked the candlelight, the hat shouted, Gryffindor. The table on the left erupted, the red-headed brothers loudest of all, and Harry took the hat off and handed it back to McGonagall and walked to the cheering. And only he, and the hat now settling onto the next child's head, knew that the loudest welcome in the hall had just been given to the quietest thing in it, and that two creatures 1,000 years old had met over the head of a boy and agreed, without a single witness, to keep each other's secrets to the end of their long, strange lives. He sat among the Gryffindors and let them clap him on the back and learned their names and gave each name the real attention that cost him nothing and bought him everything. And only when the noise had folded back into the general roar of the feast did he let himself look once up the hall to the high table where the teachers sat, to find the player at last with his own eyes. Albus Dumbledore was easy to find, because the eye went to him the way it had gone to Harry in the pub, the same pull, the gravity of a person a room arranges itself around. He sat in a great chair at the center of the high table with a long silver beard and half-moon glasses and an air of mild benevolent attention, and he was watching the Gryffindor table. And as Harry found him, Dumbledore found Harry, and for 1 second across the length of the great hall the oldest player in the wizarding world looked into the eyes of the youngest oldest creature in it, and tried, with a craft Harry felt as a soft inquiring pressure at the front of his mind, to look through him. Harry gave him the parlor. He had built it for exactly this, the bright ordinary room with the window onto Privet Drive, furnished with the dull hopeful thoughts of an orphan who has just been sorted into the brave house and cannot believe his luck, and he let Dumbledore's gentle pressure settle into the parlor and find it warm and lit and entirely convincing. A boy overwhelmed, a boy grateful, a boy with a hero's scar and no idea what to do with it. And behind the parlor the mansion stood dark and watched the watcher watch the parlor, and learned more from the watching than Dumbledore learned from the watched, because the pressure told Harry things. It told him that Dumbledore tried to read every child and felt no guilt about it, that the reading was so habitual it had stopped feeling to him like an intrusion, that he believed, the way the cartographer had believed, that his reasons made the reading kind. It told Harry the exact texture of the player's confidence, the confidence of a man who had looked through everyone he had ever met and assumed, reasonably, on the evidence of a long victorious life, that there was no one left in the world he could not eventually see to the bottom of. Then the pressure withdrew, satisfied, and Dumbledore's eyes moved on down the table with a small kind crinkle, and Harry looked away first, a beat before he had to, because a boy looks away first, and let the player believe he had taken the measure of the Potter child in a single glance across a feast. It was the most useful lie Harry had told all day, and he had not said a word to tell it. He had simply let a powerful, kind, certain man keep the certainty that was already his only real weakness, and 1,000 years had taught Harry that you do not correct an enemy's one flaw. You furnish it, you keep it warm, you visit it the way you visit a door until the day you need it open. His scar prickled once sharp, and Harry traced the prickle the way the time arts had taught him and found its true source, and the finding was the last lesson of the night and the most important. The pain was not coming from Dumbledore. It was coming from further down the table, from the pale young man in the turban, Professor Quirrell, who sat beside a sallow, hook-nosed teacher in black and was at that moment talking to him, and the fold behind Harry's scar was answering the nearness of the fold under the turban, the sleeping, hungry guest, and the prickle was the two slivers of one enemy recognizing each other across a crowded hall. Harry let his hand go to the scar, a boy rubbing a sore place, and used the gesture to cover the half-second in which he confirmed what he had suspected since the pub. That the threat wore Quirrell, that the teacher in black beside him was a misdirection the whole castle would fall for, the obvious sour, suspicious teacher who glared and swept and looked the part, and that the real thing was the stammerer no one feared, the guest growing slowly fat on its host 3 seats down, waiting, like everything in Harry's life, for a clock it did not know had been changed. He ate the feast. He laughed at the twins' jokes and meant some of it. And under the laughing the mansion finished placing the knight's pieces on the board, the castle his own age, the hat that had kept his secret and asked him to keep its own, the bossy girl built to notice, the freckled boy who bloomed, the kind certain player at the high table with his one warm flaw, and the enemy in the turban with its sleeping hunger, and Harry Potter sat in the middle of all of it, 11 years old and every inch a careless eye could measure. And began the long, patient work of a watcher hidden among the watched. The next morning the work became specific, because the next morning there were classes, and classes were where a 1,000-year-old mind had to learn the most delicate magic of its new life, which was the art of being taught. He had thought it would be tedious. It was a little. But it was also the heart of the concealment, the daily calibration that would either hold his cover for 7 years or crack it in a week, and Harry approached it the way he had approached the braided 7, as a problem with a clean solution that only looked simple. The rule he set himself was austere. He would be very good and never best. He would learn fast because a boy who had bought every book in Flourish and Blots was allowed to learn fast, but he would learn fast in the visible way, the way that left a trail of effort a teacher could see and credit, and he would reserve the mansion entirely, never once let it touch a wand in a classroom, because the gap between what an 11-year-old could do with effort and what Harry could do without it was a gap no alibi on earth could paper over. Transfiguration first, McGonagall, a witch with a spine like a wand and eyes that missed nothing, who turned her desk into a pig and back, and then set them all to turning a match into a needle. Harry watched the other children fail at it for a while, watched the grammar of the thing the way he could not help watching grammar, and then did it wrong on purpose twice, a match gone silver and still wooden, a match gone pointed and still a match, the exact believable progress of a gifted beginner, before he let it become, on the third try, a passable needle, eye and point and shine, and put up his hand to be seen doing it. Because the whole purpose of the exercise was to be seen doing it slightly better than anyone and nowhere near as well as he could. McGonagall awarded Gryffindor a point and looked at him a half-second longer than she looked at the others, and Harry let her, because a teacher who is mildly impressed is a teacher who has filed you as talented, and talented was the shelf he was building for himself one calibrated success at a time. Charms, tiny Professor Flitwick, who squeaked when he read Harry's name and toppled off his pile of books, and feathers that were meant to float and mostly did not. Harry's floated on the second attempt, not the first, the second, because first was a story and second was a boy, and he made sure his incantation was a hair too loud and his wand movement a degree too wide, the visible labor that licensed the result. Hermione Granger, 2 seats away, got hers up on the first try with a swish and flick so crisp it was almost rude, and looked around for the recognition the achievement had earned her, and found the room looking at Harry instead, at the boy who lived making his feather wobble into the air a moment behind her, and Harry watched her face do the brittle thing it did, and understood that he had a problem with Hermione that no amount of calibration would solve. Because the one thing she needed from the world was to be the best at exactly the thing he was pretending to be second best at, and his pretending was costing her the only coin she valued, and she did not even know it was pretending, which made it worse, because she thought she was losing to a prodigy when she was in fact losing to a man holding back 1,000 years so as not to be seen. And then potions in the dungeons with Severus Snape, the sour teacher in black from the high table, who swept in with his cloak snapping and his black eyes glittering and went straight for Harry in front of the whole class, the way a man goes for a thing he has already decided to hate. "Potter," he said softly, "our new celebrity. Tell me, what would I get if I added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormwood?" It was a trap, and Harry saw the whole of it in the first syllable, and saw behind the trap the misdirection it served. Snape was performing, not the contempt was real, sourced from some old wound Harry could read in him like a bruise, a hatred of the Potter name that had nothing to do with Harry and everything to do with a face Harry shared. But the spectacle of the contempt, the public theatrical singling out, that was a performance, and Harry understood in a cold flash what it was for. A teacher who hates the famous Potter boy loudly in front of witnesses on the first day is a teacher everyone will watch. And a watched teacher is a teacher with an alibi, and Harry's whole soul went quiet with the recognition that Severus Snape, whatever else he was making himself the obvious suspect on purpose, drawing every eye in the castle onto his black cloak and his glittering malice, so that no one would look past him to the stammerer in the turban. Harry did not yet know whose side Snape was on, but he knew, watching Snape bait him, that Snape knew about the thing under Quirrell's turban and was hiding it the way Harry hid the mansion behind a louder, simpler, uglier truth. So Harry answered. He knew the answer, he had known it for 900 years. The draught of living death was a child's potion where he came from. But he answered the way a first year would answer, with a flicker of effort, eyes going up and to the left in the universal gesture of a person reaching for a thing half remembered from a book. I think that makes the draught of living death, sir. Snape's lip curled and he fired the next two. The Bezoar, the Wolfsbane, and Harry got the Bezoar cleanly, a boy who had read his book. And then on the third he paused and frowned and got it almost right and not quite. Monkshood and Wolfsbane are the same plant, but he let himself fumble the third name they went by, so that Snape could have the small ugly pleasure of correcting him, because a man performing contempt needs to land a blow to keep the performance convincing, and Harry, who needed Snape's performance to continue for reasons Snape would never guess, handed him the blow like a gift, 5 points from Gryffindor for his cheek. The class flinched. Harry lowered his eyes, a boy stung, and behind the lowered eyes the mansion noted that it had just done a favor for a man it did not trust, in service of a plan it had not finished, against an enemy that did not yet know the clock had changed, and found the arrangement entirely satisfactory. Hermione caught him on the Friday in the corridor outside Charms with the directness of a person who has decided that the polite delay before an accusation is a waste of everyone's time. You don't take notes, she said. In Transfiguration, in Charms, you watch Professor McGonagall do the spell and then you just look at the match or the feather for a while before you try. Everyone else copies the wand movement off the board. You don't even look at the board. She had her arms folded over a stack of books and her chin was up, and under the challenge was the old brittle engine, testing him, daring him to be one more person who would fail to be as serious as she was. It's like you're not learning it. It's like you already know how it's supposed to feel and you're just waiting for your hand to catch up. It was the most accurate sentence anyone had said about him since the cartographer, and it had been said by an 11-year-old in a corridor, and Harry took half a second to admire it before he buried it. I read a lot over the summer, he said, a little embarrassed. I bought too many books. I think I read the theory so many times that the wand part is the only bit I haven't practiced, so I'm sort of behind and ahead at the same time. It's a stupid way to learn. My friend Ron keeps beating me at the actual spells. He shrugged, rueful, and offered her the one thing the engine could not resist, which was a problem framed as needing her. You take proper notes. Could I copy the wand movements off you? I keep getting the angle wrong. He watched the engine stall. She had been braced for a liar or a show-off, and he had handed her a flaw and a compliment in the same breath, admitted she was better at the part that counted and asked for her help, and the armor of being unanswerable had nothing to push against, because he had agreed with her before she finished accusing him. Well, she said, and the chin came down a degree. Yes, obviously, you're holding the wand too stiff, that's why your angle's wrong. And she fell into step beside him, lecturing, happy in the particular way of a person who has finally been asked, and Harry let her teach him to hold a wand he had wielded for 1,000 years, and understood that he had just made the cleverest person in the castle into an ally by the simple expedient of losing to her on purpose, and that the cleverness was also a debt because she meant it, and he did not entirely. And 1,000 years had taught him that the debts you take on by being liked under false pretenses are the ones that come due at the worst possible time. Defense against the dark arts came on the Thursday, and it was the class Harry had been waiting for and dreading in equal measure, though he let neither show, because dread and anticipation were both bets, and the only thing he intended to do in Quirrell's classroom was watch. The room reeked of garlic. The other students wrinkled their noses and whispered that Quirrell kept it to ward off a vampire he was supposed to have met in the Black Forest, and Harry let them believe it, because the truth was funnier and more terrible and entirely his. The garlic was not to keep a thing out of the room. It was to keep a thing quiet in the room, hung in reeking ropes around a turban to mask a smell that was not garlic at all, the cold grave smell of a guest that should have been dead and was not, and the stammering man wore his own warding around his head like a crown of thorns, and told the class it was for vampires. Quirrell stuttered through a lesson on counter-jinxes that he plainly half remembered and wholly feared, and Harry sat at the back and did the real work of the hour, which was to read the thing under the turban without letting the thing under the turban read him. It was the most dangerous concealment he had attempted since the chamber, harder than the hat, harder than Dumbledore, because the hat had been kin and Dumbledore had been merely human, and the thing wrapped against the back of Quirrell's skull was neither. It was a fold like his own. It was the only other folded thing he had ever met, a sliver of a soul torn loose and bound into a living host, ancient in malice if not in years, and it had spent a decade learning to be patient in the dark the way Harry had spent 1,000 years learning the same lesson in a different dark, and that made it the one reader in all the world who might look at the small, clumsy fold behind Harry's scar and recognize the shape of a thing hiding inside a thing. So when the fold under the turban stirred, as it stirred the moment Harry's scar came within 30 feet of it, when it turned its sleeping attention toward the marked child it had made and brushed, idly, hungrily, against the front of Harry's mind, Harry did the hardest thing the mansion had ever asked of him. He opened the parlor to the enemy. He let the torn soul of the worst wizard in modern history walk into the bright ordinary room behind his scar and find exactly what it expected to find. A frightened boy with a sore forehead, a child it had marked and failed to kill, weak, ignorant, useful, beneath contempt. He furnished the room with pain because the enemy fed on the scar and would trust a scar that hurt, and he let it hurt, let the prickle flare into a believable child's ache, and behind the ache the dark mansion stood utterly still and let the monster look its fill and find nothing and learn nothing and withdraw with the lazy disdain of a predator that has sniffed a thing too small to bother eating yet. It did not know. That was the whole of what Harry came away with, and it was worth a term of garlic. The enemy had been inside the parlor and had not felt the mansion around it, had looked at the child and seen only the child, had no more suspicion that the child it had marked was 1,000 years deep than Dumbledore had, than Ollivander had, than the whole bright, credulous world had. It was weak, weaker than it pretended even to its host, feeding in sips, months from any move large enough to matter, anchored to a stammering man and a stolen object that Harry now understood was the small, grubby package from the deepest vault in Gringotts, the made thing humming with old grammar, the thing the player had moved to the school on the same morning he had moved the marked child and the hidden enemy onto the same square. The board was complete. Every piece was in place. And the youngest, oldest creature on it had just walked unseen through the one square the others all believed they controlled, and come away knowing the position better than any player at the table, and feeling under the garlic and the ache and the stammer, something it took him the walk back up to the tower to name, because he allowed himself only one named feeling a day, and he spent this one carefully. Not fear, he had worn fear out. The thing he felt, looking at a board where he could already see the end game and the cost of it, was the old clean loneliness of being, once again, the only one in the room who knew what the room contained. By the end of that first week the days had found a rhythm, and each evening Harry climbed the moving staircases through the talking portraits in the vast warm impossible machine of the school, and Hedwig was waiting on the sill of the Gryffindor tower with her round unhurried eyes, and Harry let the front room face come off for the length of one corridor where no one living could see him, and was, for 30 seconds, simply ancient and simply tired, a watcher at the start of a very long watch. Then a portrait said good evening to him, kindly, and Harry put the child back on, and answered it, and went into his house to learn the names of the people he was going to spend the next 7 years not quite letting himself love. Chapter 4 and Chapter 5. The Headmaster's Gambit. By October Harry had confirmed what he had suspected since the pub, which was that Albus Dumbledore was playing him, and had begun the more interesting work of confirming that Dumbledore did not know he was being played back. The evidence accumulated the way good evidence does, quietly, in things that almost made sense. A book on his curriculum that was a year too advanced slipped into his stack by a librarian who could not say who had requested it. A corridor on the 3rd floor forbidden to students on pain of a very painful death, announced at the opening feast with a theatricality that no headmaster who actually wished a place avoided would ever employ, because the surest way to send a brave child toward a door is to forbid it from a podium. A series of small, frictionless coincidences that put Harry, again and again, within sight of mysteries he was clearly meant to wonder about. Harry wondered about them on schedule, visibly, because a piece that refuses to move alerts the player that it is not a piece, and Harry had no intention of alerting anyone to anything. But behind the visible wondering the mansion read the pattern, and the pattern was a curriculum, a second secret curriculum laid over the first, and its subject was Harry Potter, and its teacher meant to find out what his marked boy was made of by feeding him, in careful doses, the appetite for a trap. It was, Harry conceded, good work. Dumbledore was not crude. He did not push, he tilted the floor and let gravity look like choice, the most elegant manipulation there was, the kind that leaves the manipulated convinced of their own free will because technically they had it the whole way down. A lesser observer would never have caught it. Harry caught it because he had spent 1,000 years being the only mind in a hall designed to shape him, and a person who has survived the chamber's slow, benevolent pressure can feel a tilted floor through his shoes. So he let himself be tilted and slid where he was meant to slide, and arrived at each mystery a half-beat behind a boy who was genuinely curious, and gave the player exactly the responses the curriculum was testing for, and learned, with every test he passed, a little more about the examiner than the examiner learned about him. The flying lesson taught him the shape of the cover he would wear in public, and he took it gratefully, because a famous talent is the safest disguise a dangerous man can own. Madam Hooch turned the first years loose on a row of battered school brooms, and the brooms, sensing children, behaved like children's brooms, bucking and rolling, and Harry's came up into his hand at the word with the eager snap of a thing that had found, for once, a rider who knew what it was. He had never flown a broom. He had flown without one in the chamber in the high years when the time arts had taught him the grammar of his own weight. A broom was a crutch shaped like freedom, the same lie as a wand, the power in the rider dressed up to live in the stick. But the lie was a beautiful one, and the moment his feet left the grass Harry understood that he had been handed, free, the single most useful piece of cover in the school. A seeker was a prodigy the world adored and explained in the same breath. A seeker was watched constantly and suspected of nothing, because flying genius asked no questions about a hard childhood or a strange stillness. It simply was, the way a singing voice was, a gift that fell on a child and meant nothing sinister. So when Neville Longbottom's broom ran away with him and dumped him and his remembrall in the grass, and Draco Malfoy snatched the little glass ball and flung it high and far across the lawn out of the pure boredom of a child who has never been refused, Harry went up after it. He calibrated the flight the way he calibrated everything. He let the broom labor a little, let the catch look hard, let his body show the strain a gifted 11-year-old's body would show pulling out of a 50-foot dive, and he closed his hand on the remembrall a foot above the grass and pulled level, and came down to a landing that was 1 degree messier than perfect, because perfect was a question and messy brilliant was an answer the world already had a name for. Professor McGonagall came across the lawn at a near run, and Harry arranged his face for the expected detention, and got instead a seeker's place on the Gryffindor team, the youngest in a century, and the whole school had its story about Harry Potter refreshed and reconfirmed. A natural, a flyer, a boy whose every gift could now be filed under the one gift everyone had seen. He thanked McGonagall, a boy astonished at his luck, and behind the astonishment the mansion noted that it had just acquired the perfect alibi for being inexplicably good at things, and that the alibi had cost it nothing but a single calibrated catch. Dumbledore summoned him in late October, and the summons was the Gambit's true face, and Harry walked up the moving spiral stair to the headmaster's office, knowing he was about to be examined by the only living person clever enough to be dangerous and certain enough to be beaten. The office was a den of soft power, instruments whirring on spindle-legged tables, portraits of old headmasters pretending to sleep, a red and gold bird on a perch that turned its head when Harry entered and looked at him with eyes that were not an owl's unhurried eyes but something older and warmer, and Harry gave the bird a respectful inward nod, one ancient thing to another, because a phoenix had given the feather in his wand and the feather in the enemy's. Phoenix was the third thing in the castle his own age, and it watched him with a recognition the headmaster could not see. Dumbledore sat behind a great desk with his long fingers steepled and his half-moon glasses catching the firelight, and he smiled, and the smile was warm and real and meant, and behind it, the moment Harry sat, came the soft inquiring pressure at the front of his mind, gentle as a hand testing a door that the owner has been assured is unlocked. "Lemon drop," said Dumbledore. "No. They are a muggle sweet I am rather fond of." He let the silence stretch, watching the way a fisherman watches a still float. "I wish simply to see how you are settling, Harry. It is not every child who arrives at our world the way you did, from a cupboard into a crowd. I have wondered this whole long autumn how you have found it. It was beautifully done. There were 3 hooks in it," and Harry counted them while his boy's face filled with the shy gratitude of a child noticed by a great man. The cupboard dropped in casually to see whether Harry knew that Dumbledore knew, and how he felt about the knowing. The phrase "the way you did," and opening onto the scar in the night and the thing behind both. And under all of it, the steady soft pressure, reading not the answers but the flinches, because Dumbledore was a master, and a master knows that the words a person chooses are a prepared defense, and the body's small betrayals are the truth. Harry had no small betrayals. He had worn them out at a chalk line 1,000 years deep. So he did a more difficult thing than hiding, which was to manufacture exactly the betrayals the examiner expected, and feed them to the pressure one at a time, so that Dumbledore would leave the room not empty-handed but full of a curated and entirely false catch. "It's better than the cupboard, sir," Harry said, and let his voice go very slightly flat on the word cupboard, the flatness of a child stepping carefully around a thing that still has teeth, and felt the pressure quicken with interest because he had just handed it a wound. "I'm sorry. I'm not supposed to talk about they didn't like me to talk. It's hard to stop." He looked at his hands, a boy ashamed of a hurt that was not his fault, and behind the shame the mansion watched Dumbledore receive the gift and begin, helplessly, to build the explanation it had been engineered to build. Here was a child who had been starved of regard and had armored himself against it. Here was the source of the strange composure the staff had remarked on, the stillness, the watchfulness, the way the Potter boy seemed older than his years. Not a mystery, a trauma. A sad, ordinary, explicable trauma, the kind a wise old headmaster had seen 100 times and understood to his bones, and Harry watched Dumbledore's whole inquiry bend, gently, gratefully, toward the comfortable shape of a problem he already knew how to solve. "You have your mother's eyes," Dumbledore said then, gently, and it was the deepest hook of all, and Harry felt the pressure go very still behind it, waiting. "Lily, I knew her. She was one of the brightest students ever to pass through this castle, and one of the kindest, which is rarer, and the two together rarest of all. James, your father, was a man of great courage and a certain amount of mischief. They loved you very much, Harry. I want you to know that, whatever you were told in that house, whatever they let you believe." Here was the leverage, laid on the desk between them with a craftsman's care, the orphan's oldest wound offered up to see how he bled, because a child who weeps for the parents he cannot remember is a child whose heart can be read like a map, and a master reads the heart and not the words. Harry let himself bleed, a little the true amount, because he did not in fact remember them, and the not remembering was a real and bottomless thing, and the cheapest disguise was a true feeling shown at the right moment. He let his eyes go bright and his voice go careful. "I don't remember them," he said. "People keep telling me about them, and it's like hearing about strangers who were supposed to be mine." It was true, and it landed as truth lands, and Dumbledore's face moved with a sorrow that was also real, and the pressure eased again, satisfied, because the master had found a grieving boy where a grieving boy ought to be, and a thing found exactly where you expect it stops being a thing you look at twice. Harry had given him nothing but the truth, arranged. That was the deepest art of the parlor, the one the echoes had taught him over a century of failed concealments. That the most convincing lie is a true thing pointed in a useful direction, and that a man who never has to invent a single false fact can pass any reader alive, because there is nothing false in him to find. "You will never," said Dumbledore, and there was real feeling in it, the steel under the warmth gone soft for a moment with something that might have been remorse, "be made to be silent here, Harry, that I promise you." He had decided something. Harry could feel the pressure ease, the float settle, the fisherman content with a fish that was not the one in the water. They talked of small things after that, Quidditch, his classes, his friends, and Dumbledore was kind and funny, and the conversation was, Harry thought, one of the pleasantest he had had since the cartographer, which was its own quiet danger, because the most dangerous person in any hall is the benevolent one with a plan, and the second most dangerous is the one you find yourself wanting to be liked by. He almost slipped once. Dumbledore, rising to see him out, paused by the perch and stroked the phoenix and said lightly, "His name is Fawkes. He is older than he looks. Phoenixes carry their years differently from the rest of us. They burn down to ash and rise again, and so a phoenix of 1,000 years wears the face of a fledgling, and you would never know to look at him, all that he has seen." And the headmaster's blue eyes came up, mild and twinkling, and rested on Harry, and the sentence hung in the warm air with a second meaning so precise that for a quarter of a second Harry could not be sure it was an accident. The mansion went to full alert behind the parlor, silent, weighing. Either it was the idle poetry of a man who loved his bird, or it was a hook so fine that Harry had nearly missed it, a line cast not to catch a flinch but to provoke one. "You would never know to look at him all that he has seen," said to a boy whose stillness the headmaster could not explain, watching for the flicker of a child who recognizes himself. Harry gave him nothing, because nothing was the safe play, and 1,000 years had taught him to take the safe play when the stakes were total. He looked at the phoenix with a boy's simple wonder and said, 1,000 years. "That's brilliant," in the bright empty voice of a child who had heard only the magic and none of the meaning, and Dumbledore's eyes crinkled, and the moment passed, and Harry walked down the spiral stair unable to decide, for the first time since the pub, whether the player had seen something or merely tested for it, and the uncertainty was itself the most useful thing he carried out of the office. Because it told him that Dumbledore was better than Ollivander and better than the hat at the one thing that could undo him, and that he would have to be played more carefully than Harry had played anyone since the chamber, and possibly more carefully than the chamber itself. Then it was Halloween, and the troll came, and Harry paid, for the first time in either of his long lives, a price in concealment for a reason that was not strategy. He had not meant to. The mansion did not spend its cover on charity. That was the discipline talking, the cold arithmetic that had kept him alive, and the arithmetic was clear that the safest course when a mountain troll blundered into the dungeons during the feast was to file out with the other Gryffindors toward the tower and let the staff handle a problem the staff was equipped to handle. He had filed out. He had taken 3 steps toward the tower in the panicked crowd when Ron said the thing that broke the arithmetic, which was, "Hermione doesn't know. She's been in the girls' bathroom all afternoon. She doesn't know about the troll." Harry stopped. He had built a door in his mind to keep one thing safe from 1,000 years, and he had spent the autumn carefully not opening other doors, not letting himself want the owl or the freckled boy or the bossy brilliant girl who had cried in a bathroom, because a room full of children had laughed at the one thing she was proud of, and now the arithmetic said walk to the tower, and something older than the arithmetic, something the herbarium had woken on the 400th ring, said that a girl who tested everyone because she was sure of being abandoned was about to be abandoned correctly on schedule by the whole castle, unless one person on the third step of the staircase decided that being unmatched was worth less than being there. He decided. He had told himself in the chamber that he chose to remain a person on purpose, every morning, one hand at a time, and this was the morning, and the hand he moved was the one that grabbed Ron's sleeve and turned them both back into the emptying corridor toward the second-floor bathroom, and the thing that was lumbering toward it through the dark. They reached the door a stride ahead of the troll and a breath behind it, which was the worst possible margin, because it meant the troll was already inside with Hermione when they came through the door. It was 12 feet of gray muscle and stupidity with a club the size of Ron, and it had Hermione backed against the shattered sinks, and it raised the club, and in the half-second before it came down, Harry did the most dangerous thing he had done since he let the enemy into the parlor, which was to fight at his real speed while making it look like luck. This was a craft of its own, and he had rehearsed its principle 10,000 times against the echoes without ever guessing he would use it to save a child in a bathroom. The principle was misattribution, do the impossible thing in a way that hands the witness a possible story. So Harry did not unmake the troll, though he could have unspelled the crude binding that held its half-life together and dropped it to the floor as 12 feet of inert meat, because a first year does not unmake a troll and there is no book to blame it on. Instead, he reached openly for the brutal abbreviation any first year had, the levitation charm Wingardium Leviosa, the feather-floating spell Hermione herself had mastered first in Flitwick's class, and he aimed it not at the troll but at the club, and to the eye of the room he was a lucky boy who had thought to use the one spell he knew. To the troll and to the grammar he did something else entirely. He took the spell that lifts a feather and he poured into it, through the holly wand, the smallest fraction of the mansion, a precision and a force that the brutal little abbreviation had never been built to carry, and the club did not wobble up the way a charmed feather wobbles. It tore out of the troll's fist as though a god had flicked it, spun once, and came down on the troll's own skull with the entire weight of 12 feet of monster behind a blow Harry had merely redirected, and the troll dropped like a felled tower, and the bathroom rang with the silence after. To Ron, gaping, Harry had got lucky with the one spell they'd all just learned. To Hermione, alive against the sinks with troll filth in her hair and her whole certain world rearranged, something did not fit, and Harry saw it not fit in her eyes even then in the wreckage, the same date a frown she had given him on the train, because she had cast that exact charm 100 times and knew to the ounce what it could lift, and what had just happened to the club was not what Wingardium Leviosa did. He had paid the price knowingly. He had shown the one witness in the castle built to notice a thing she would not be able to forget, and he had done it to keep her alive, and as the teachers came pounding down the corridor he made the second deliberate choice of the night, which was to step in front of both of them when McGonagall demanded to know what had happened and to lie. "It was my fault, Professor," Harry said, a reckless, brave Gryffindor boy who had gone looking for a troll. "I thought I could handle it. Hermione came to find us, she told us not to, we wouldn't listen." He gave McGonagall the story the castle wanted, the hero and his friends and a lucky charm, and he gave Hermione in the same breath a debt and a gift and a question all at once, because he had taken the blame that should have been hers for being in the bathroom, and a girl armored and being unanswerable had just been defended by someone who expected nothing back, and Harry watched the armor take the blow and not know what to do with it. 5 points, a near thing, the teachers swept the troll away. And Hermione Granger, walking back to the tower between the two of them, said quietly to Harry, "That wasn't Leviosa," and Harry said, "It was, I just got lucky," and she said nothing, and the nothing was the beginning of the only friendship Harry would ever have with a person clever enough to eventually understand him, and he knew it, and he let it begin anyway, because 1,000 years alone had taught him exactly what it was worth and exactly what it would cost, and he had decided. On a staircase that he was willing to pay. From that night the three of them were a unit, the way children become a unit, by surviving a thing together that the adults around them had not. Ron had stood in a bathroom with a club coming down and not run, and a person learns who he is in the half-second he does not run, and Ron had learned that he was braver than the 6th of 7 brothers had ever been allowed to believe, and he loved Harry for the room in which he had learned it. Hermione had stopped correcting Harry in class. It was a small thing, and Harry read it as an enormous one, because the correcting had been her armor and she had set it down, not because she had lost the need to be unanswerable, but because she had decided on the walk back to the tower that the one who had taken the blame for her was worth more to her than the last word, and a girl who would trade the last word for a friend was a girl who had been starving for one longer than she would ever say. Harry let it happen. That was the whole of his part in it, the letting, and it was not nothing, because every instinct the chamber had drilled into him said that a watcher does not acquire dependence, that a person you are loved by is a person who will look at you closely, and the two people now attached to him were the two best equipped in the school to eventually see too much. He knew it. He let it happen anyway, and he understood the letting for what it was, which was the slow, patient suicide of the discipline. The thing the cartographer had warned could not survive contact with a world that had rain in it and hedges in it and a freckled boy who would not run. He had kept one door against 1,000 years. He was opening now by small daily degrees, a second and a third, and he did the arithmetic on the risk every night and came out every night on the side of the risk, because 1,000 years had taught him the precise and terrible price of a life with the doors all shut, and he had paid it once, and he had decided on a staircase on Halloween that he would rather pay almost anything than pay that again. The aftermath sharpened the board because Harry, lying awake in the tower while Ron snored, did the arithmetic the heroics had interrupted, and it came out wrong in the most useful way. A mountain troll does not wander into a castle warded by 1,000 years of magic. It is let in. And a troll led into a castle during a feast, when every teacher is gathered in one hall and every corridor is empty, is not an attack. It is a diversion, a great stupid lumbering distraction designed to send the whole staff stampeding to the dungeons while one quiet figure walked, unwatched, toward a forbidden door on the 3rd floor. Harry had felt it in the chaos if he was honest, and had let the feeling go because Hermione had been in a bathroom. He turned it over now in the dark. There had been one teacher missing from the stampede. Snape had not run to the dungeons with the others. Harry had seen him in the confusion going the wrong way up toward the 3rd floor with a limp he had not had that morning. The castle would conclude what it was meant to conclude, that the sour, suspicious man in black was the villain, creeping toward the thing everyone now knew was hidden behind the forbidden door. And Harry, alone in the dark with the whole position laid out, concluded the opposite, because he had read the board too long to be fooled by the obvious piece. Snape had gone up to the 3rd floor to stop something. The limp was a wound, and the wound was on the leg, and the thing behind the forbidden door, Harry now understood, was guarded by something with teeth, and a man does not get a wounded leg guarding a thing he is trying to steal. Snape was hurt because Snape had gone to the 3rd floor to head off the one who had let the troll in, the stammerer in the turban, who had used the feast and the diversion to make his first move toward the small, grubby package from the deepest vault in Gringotts. The enemy had begun to play. That was the change, and it was the only change that mattered, and Harry lay in the dark and felt the whole long autumn tip, at last, from watching into the early movements of a thing that would have to end. Quirrell was going for the stone. Harry was nearly certain now that it was the stone, the philosopher's stone, the made thing humming with old grammar, the only object in the world a torn half-soul would want badly enough to risk a school for, because the stone made the elixir of life, and a thing that should be dead and is not would want, above everything, to stop being a thing that should be dead. Dumbledore had moved it here. Dumbledore had hidden it behind a forbidden door and a series of trials and a podium announcement designed to draw exactly the brave and the curious. And Harry understood, with a cold completeness that settled the last piece of the gambit into place, that the stone was bait, that the whole arrangement was a trap the player had built not to keep the enemy out, but to draw him in, onto ground of Dumbledore's choosing, into trials of Dumbledore's design. Where the most powerful wizard alive could deal with him on his own terms, it was a good plan. It was, Harry thought, almost exactly the plan he would have made. And it had one flaw, the same flaw every plan of Dumbledore's had, which was that the player believed he was the only mind in the castle old enough to see the whole board, and so he had built his beautiful trap without accounting for the piece that was not a piece, the marked boy 1,000 years deep, who could see the trap and the trapper and the trapped all at once, and had not yet decided which of the three he intended to be. The first Quidditch match came in November, and the enemy used it to make his second move, and Harry, 50 feet above the pitch on a broom he did not need, read the whole of the attempt and let the castle believe it had read it wrong. He had been in the air 4 minutes, scanning for the snitch with a seeker's bright public talent, when the broom tried to kill him. It happened the way a curse happens to a thing rather than a person. The nimbus gave a violent lurch, then another, bucking and rolling under him with a malice that no school accident explained, trying to throw him off into a 50-foot fall onto frozen ground. The crowd below saw a boy fighting a broom gone wild. Harry, who could have stepped off the thing and stood on the air with a thought, did no such reckless legible thing. Instead, he gripped the handle and let his body do the desperate scrabbling dance of a child barely holding on, a seeker in trouble, a story the whole stadium could follow, and behind the dance the mansion went perfectly calm and did the real work, which was to trace the curse to its caster. It was not hard. A jinx that holds a flying broom against its rider has to be sustained by an unbroken line of sight and an unbroken mutter, and Harry, hanging sideways off a bucking broom with troll-killing precision hidden inside a child's panic, swept the staff stand and found the line in half a second. Quirrell. The stammering professor sat rigid in the stand with his eyes fixed and unblinking on Harry and his lips moving in a steady soundless rhythm that had no stammer in it at all. The stutter dropped like a coat the moment no one was meant to be watching, and Harry felt the shape of the curse and knew it for the enemy's own hand on the wand, the torn half-soul reaching out through its host to finish, in front of a cheering crowd, the killing it had bungled 10 years before. And beside Quirrell, 3 seats down, another set of lips was moving, and another line of magic ran up to the broom, and it was not a second jinx. It was a counter. Snape sat with his black eyes locked on Harry and his mouth working, and the magic pouring off him was steadying the broom by inches against Quirrell's malice, the 2 spells wrestling for Harry's life over the heads of a crowd that could see neither, and Harry hung between them and confirmed, past the last shadow of doubt, the thing he had reasoned out in the dark after the troll. The obvious villain was his protector, and the stammerer no one feared was his murderer, and the whole castle had the board exactly backwards, which was precisely how Harry needed it to stay. Then Hermione, somewhere far below, certain as ever and wrong in the most useful possible way, did the thing that ended it. She had seen Snape's lips moving and his eyes fixed on Harry, and she had drawn the obvious conclusion, the conclusion the enemy had spent all term arranging the castle to draw, and she had fought her way along the staff stand and set a brilliant blue jet of fire to the hem of Snape's robes to break what she believed was his curse. It broke Quirrell's instead. Scramble, the jostling, the small commotion of a teacher discovering his robes alight. Quirrell's unblinking line of sight broke for the half-second the jinx could not survive, and the broom came still, and Harry let himself slump back onto it gasping like a rescued child. And the crowd roared, and not one soul in the stadium understood that a brilliant girl had just saved his life by attacking the wrong man for the right reasons, or that the right man was sitting beside her victim, furious and unthanked. Having spent the whole match keeping the boy who lived alive. Harry caught the snitch a minute later, a dive and a snatch and a near swallow that brought the whole of Gryffindor down onto the pitch screaming his name, and he let them carry him, the hero, the natural, the youngest seeker in a century, and he wore the adoration like the cover it was and read over their heads, the staff stand emptying, Quirrell slipping away pale and shaking with the particular exhaustion of a host whose guest has overreached, Snape limping after him with murder in his sallow face. The enemy had moved twice now, the troll and the broom, and missed twice, and Harry understood that the missing would not last, that a thing which wanted the stone badly enough to curse a child in front of 1,000 witnesses was a thing running out of patience, and that the slow watching autumn was nearly over, and the winter would be where it ended. Through the gray weeks toward Christmas, the 3 of them hunted the secret of the 3rd-floor door, and Harry conducted the hunt the way he conducted everything, by knowing the answer and steering his friends toward discovering it, and the steering cost him something he had not expected, which was the small private shame of a man manipulating people he had begun to love. He knew it was the stone. He had known since the cart ride in Gringotts, the package humming with old grammar, the deepest vault, the one object a thing that should be dead would burn down a school to own. But Harry Potter could not simply announce the Philosopher's Stone to a library table, because there was no book he had been seen reading that would explain how a first year had named the most closely guarded object in Britain, and so he did the patient, indirect work of letting Hermione find it, which she was magnificently equipped to do once she had been pointed, without knowing she had been pointed, at the right shelf. He dropped the name Nicholas Flamel where she would trip on it, a half-remembered thing from a chocolate frog card, the only place a famous alchemist appeared in a form a child could be seen to have read, and he watched her seize the thread and pull, watched her cross-reference and chase and finally surface, flushed with triumph, from a vast old tome with the answer she believed she had found alone, the stone, the elixir, 665 years of a life that should have ended and had not. Ron cheered her. Harry cheered her too, and meant the cheer, because she had done real and brilliant work, and underneath the cheer the mansion noted without mercy that he had just run his dearest friend exactly the way the player across the castle ran him, tilting her floor, letting gravity look like genius, and that the only difference between Harry and Dumbledore on this point was that Harry felt the shame of it and Dumbledore, Harry was increasingly sure, had stopped. That was the new cost, and it sharpened the old loneliness rather than easing it. In the chamber he had been alone and had wanted company. Now he had company and was learning the particular isolation of being the only one at the table who knew the table was a chessboard, who could not share a single true thought without unraveling, who watched his friends rejoice at solving a riddle he had carried unsolved for them on purpose, and loved them, and used them, and could not stop doing either. Hermione closed the great book with the satisfied snap of a girl who has finally been the best at something that mattered, and Ron said they should tell Dumbledore. and Harry said no, gently, let's keep it to ourselves for now, and gave them a reason a child would accept, and kept for himself the real reason, which was that the player already knew, that the player had built the whole trap, and that the last thing Harry intended was to hand Dumbledore the knowledge that the marked boy had seen to the bottom of the board. He did not decide that autumn. He had learned in the chamber that the largest decisions are the ones you refuse to rush, and there was time, there was always time. That was the one thing he had infinitely more of than anyone on the board. But he let himself feel before he slept the thing he had been not feeling all autumn, the cost the cartographer had named on the first night and the troll had made him pay in public, and he spent his one named feeling of the day on it deliberately, because a feeling you refuse to name is a feeling that runs the house from the basement. It was loneliness, the specific loneliness of the unmatched, and it had sharpened, not dulled, with company. In the chamber, the loneliness had been simple, the clean ache of an empty hall. Here it was worse, because here the hall was full. Here there was a freckled boy who would have died beside him against the troll without once understanding what stood beside him, and a brilliant girl who had said that wasn't Leviosa and would spend years failing to solve a problem that had no solution she could bear, and a kind old player who wanted to love him and weigh him in the same breath, and a phoenix that knew, and a hat that knew, and not one human being in the whole warm crowded castle who could be told the truth and remain. He had everything he had wanted on the first night in the cupboard. He had been counted, adored, befriended, sorted into the brave house, handed an owl and a broom and a place at a table loud with people who would fight for him. And he was more alone in the middle of it than he had been at the bottom of 400 stairs, because there the loneliness had been the absence of others, and here it was the presence of others he could never reach, and 1,000 years had not taught him which of the two was harder, and he was beginning, in a full tower on Halloween, to suspect it was this one. He turned the suspicion over once more, the way he turned everything over fully, without flinching. Then he put it behind the thick door at the end of the corridor, with the rest of what he could not afford to carry in daylight, and he laid his hand against the door in the dark of his own skull until the warmth answered, still there, still his, still refusing, and he understood that the thing he kept behind it had changed without his permission. It was no longer only the memory of being counted. It had freckles now and troll filth in its hair, and a voice that said that wasn't Leviosa, and a phoenix's recognition, and the warm, impossible machine of a castle his own age. And Harry lay in the dark and let the door hold all of it, every dangerous thing he had let himself begin to want, and knew that the player across the castle was building a trap to save the world, and that the enemy in the turban was beginning to move, and that he, the only one who could see both, had just discovered the one weakness 1,000 years had failed to drill out of him, which was that he had come up the stairs wanting to be a person, and had succeeded, he thought before sleep took him, of the bell that had held its note for 1,000 years and had finally at the end been allowed to fade, and of how the fading had been the kindest thing the chamber ever did, because an ending you can hear coming is an ending you can make your peace with. There was no such mercy here. Up the stairs the endings came without warning, a troll out of a feast, a curse out of a cheering crowd, and the people he had let himself begin to love walked toward those endings blind, and he could not warn them without unmaking himself, and he could not save them all without revealing exactly how far he stood beyond them. That was the arithmetic of a life among the living, and it did not balance, and Harry lay in the dark and held it unbalanced, the way he had held a book he could not read on the first night, refusing to put it down. And that being a person was going to cost him more in the end than being the hall ever could. Chapter 5 and Chapter 6 tells the cloak came on Christmas morning, wrapped in brown paper with no name on the card, and Harry knew 3 things about it before he had finished unfolding it, and the third thing was the one that mattered. The first was that it was real, a true invisibility cloak, not the cheap demiguise hair imitations that lost their power in a decade, but the deep old kind, the kind that did not fade, woven from a thread the chamber's archives had named on the highest ring, and called in the old tongue a thing that hides from death itself. The second was that it had been his father's, because the note said so in a looping hand that wanted very much to seem casual. Your father left this in my possession before he died. It is time it was returned to you. Use it well. And the third, the one that mattered, was that an anonymous gift is never anonymous. It is a message about who has the power to give without being thanked, and the only person in the castle with the means to have kept James Potter's cloak for 10 years and the inclination to return it, unsigned, on the morning a marked boy was alone in a castle at Christmas, was the player. Dumbledore had moved another piece. He had handed Harry the one tool a curious boy would need to walk the castle at night unseen. On the same winter the stone sat behind a forbidden door, and had done it without a signature so that the giving would feel like fate rather than instruction, the tilted floor again, gravity wearing the mask of choice. Harry put the cloak on because refusing the move would alert the player as surely as racing to make it, and stood in the dormitory mirror as an empty set of pajamas, and understood that he had been handed both a gift and a leash, and that the art of the next weeks would be to let Dumbledore believe he was holding the leash while Harry went exactly where the leash was meant to lead him and learned on the way everything the player did not mean him to learn. It was, he thought, a very fine cloak. It was also the most carefully aimed thing anyone had ever given him, and a man who has been alone for 1,000 years knows the difference between a present and a placement, and grieves it a little, the grief of a person who would have liked, just once, to be given a thing for no reason but love. The castle at night was the only company he allowed himself without calculation, because the castle could not be deceived and could not be hurt and could not be used, and under the cloak through the small hours Harry walked it the way a man walks a cathedral built by people he will never meet. The stairs shifted under him with the slow patience of a thing dreaming, the portraits breathed in their frames. Torchlight pooled and failed in the long galleries, and the suits of armor held their 1,000-year postures, and everywhere under everything ran the deep grammar of the founders, worn and patched and improvised across 40 generations until the school was less a building than a long sentence still being spoken. He read it as he went, not to learn it now. He had learned it, but for the company of it, the one presence in Scotland old enough to make his 1,000 years feel ordinary. The castle knew him. He was as sure of that as he was of anything. It had known him from the boats, the way the carved stairs had known him, the way the bell had known him, and it let him walk its sleeping corridors unchallenged because it had decided, in whatever slow way a building decides, that the small ancient thing under the cloak belonged to it, and Harry, who had not belonged anywhere since a hearthstone closed over his head, took the belonging where it was offered and asked the castle no more of it than that. He used the cloak that night, and it led him, exactly as designed, to the mirror. He had not gone looking for it. That was the part he turned over afterward, because it troubled him. He had been moving through the dark castle under the cloak, mapping the wards, learning the school's sleeping grammar, when he had come to a disused classroom and felt through the door the unmistakable signature of a deep old working, and had gone in expecting a defense and found instead a mirror as tall as the ceiling in an ornate gold frame, with an inscription carved across the top that ran backward and meant, when he turned it in his mind, "I show not your face but your heart's desire." And Harry, who had read 400 rings of an archive and never flinched from a thing yet, stood in front of the mirror of Erised and looked, because 1,000 years had taught him that the things you are afraid to look at are the things you most need to see. The mirror showed him a room full of people, and the people were looking at him, and that was all, and it undid him more completely than the troll, more than the broom, more than anything since the worn light went out in a silver hall. He understood the working at once. Understanding was the only defense he had ever had, and it did not help him now. The mirror did not show the future or the dead or the merely wished for. It reached past all the small desires a person could name and found the one desire underneath them, the load-bearing want a life was built around, and it showed that, in whatever shape the heart had folded it. And Harry's heart, it turned out, had folded its deepest want into a room full of faces turned toward him, because the want under all his other wants, the thing behind the thick door at the end of the long corridor, was not power which he had, and not safety which he had outgrown the need for, and not even the dead parents he could not remember, though they were in the room. A man with his untidy hair and a woman with his green eyes. Standing among the others and looking at him with a recognition that the living had never been able to give, the want was older and simpler than grief. It was to be known. Fully to the bottom, the 1,000 years and the fold and the dark mansion and the door, all of it, seen entire by people who did not flinch and did not deceive and did not walk away. And in the mirror they were all there, his parents and the cartographer restored, and Ron and Hermione, and the hat and the phoenix and faces he did not recognize. A whole room of them, and every one of them was looking at the real Harry, the ancient one, the hidden one, and staying. And the staying was the thing his power could not buy, and his discipline could not counterfeit, and his whole long life had been spent learning to live without. He stood in front of it for a long time. He was honest enough even then to know it for the trap it was, the most beautiful trap in the castle, more dangerous than the troll, because the troll only wanted to kill him and the mirror wanted to keep him, to hold him here gazing at the one thing he could never have until the wanting wore him down to nothing, the way the discipline had offered to wear him down in the chamber, the same hollowing dressed in gold. He understood that men had wasted away in front of this glass. He understood why. And he made himself, with an effort that cost more than killing the troll had cost, turn the understanding into a wall between himself and the wanting, because a man who has spent 1,000 years learning to set down things he cannot have was, in the end, the one kind of person who could look into the mirror of Erised and walk away, and even he could only do it slowly, one hand at a time, the oldest motion he owned. The cruelest face in the glass was not his mother's, though hers undid him, it was the cartographer's. The mirror had reached into him and found the worn light restored to a whole and living shape, an old man in the robe of a vanished order, standing among the others and looking at Harry with the particular pride of a teacher whose worst student survived. And Harry stood in the disused classroom and understood that the one being who had ever known the whole of him, who had warned him and taught him and spent itself to motes, giving him the grammar and the door, was the one the mirror had to invent to complete the room, because that being was 100 years gone to ash in a hall under the sea and could never again look at the thing it had made. The mirror could show him being known. It could not give him the only witness who had ever truly known him. And Harry, who had refused the discipline 1,000 gray mornings, found that he could refuse the glass for the same reason, which was that a thing you are shown is not a thing you are owed, and that the worn light had not spent itself teaching him to hold a book he could not read so that he could waste away holding a dream he could not have. Back again, Harry. He had known Dumbledore was there for some moments before the voice came, had felt the door, had chosen not to turn, because a boy gazing at his dead parents does not hear a headmaster enter, and the performance required that he be caught. He turned now with his face arranged for the thing Dumbledore expected to find, a boy's open grief, eyes bright, and gave the player the story the mirror was supposed to have written. I can see my family, sir, my mum and dad. It was true. They were in the glass. And Harry watched Dumbledore's face soften with the particular sorrow of a man who has seen this exact grief in this exact mirror in 100 lonely children, and relax, because a marked boy weeping at his murdered parents was a marked boy exactly where the player expected him to be, a thing found where you look for it, a thing you stop looking at twice. But the relief did not come all the way, and Harry felt the snag of it, the small failure of his own performance, and traced it, and found the crack he had not meant to leave. He had turned too steadily. A boy torn from the only image he has ever had of his mother does not turn smoothly at a voice. He startles, he wipes his face, he is ashamed. Harry had turned the way a man turns from a thing he has decided to set down, controlled, complete, a half-beat too composed, and Dumbledore, who read flinches for a living, had caught the absence of a flinch and did not know what to make of it. The blue eyes rested on Harry a moment too long, mild and twinkling and underneath working, and Harry understood that he had given the player the first true tell of the year. Not a fact, nothing nameable, only a wrongness, the wrongness of a child who grieved too well, and that Dumbledore had filed it the way Harry filed things, close at hand, against a later need. So Harry spent a tell to cover a tell, which was the most expensive concealment there was and the only one left to him. He let his composure break, deliberately, a beat late, let his face crumple into the grief he had failed to perform on time, and turned back to the glass and said, "Lo, will I see them if I come back, every night?" The question of a child already addicted, already lost, and gave Dumbledore the comfortable spectacle of a boy in danger of the mirror's trap, which was a danger the player understood and could manage and felt kind managing, and the too long look eased, because a problem you can solve is a problem that stops being strange. Dumbledore had been handed a strangeness, and then, quickly, a familiar danger laid over the top of it, and he took the familiar danger gratefully, the way a reader takes a true thing pointed in a useful direction, and the strangeness slid, for now, beneath it. "The mirror will be moved to a new home tomorrow," Dumbledore said gently, "and I must ask you not to go looking for it again. It does not do to dwell on dreams, Harry, and forget to live. Remember that." And he sat down beside Harry on the floor, an old wizard and a boy in the dark before a glass full of impossible wants, and for a moment the warmth between them was real, and Harry let it be real because it was, and because the realest thing in the castle was also the most dangerous, and 1,000 years had taught him to hold those two facts in one hand. "What do you see, sir?" Harry asked, "when you look in it?" Said Dumbledore. "I see myself holding a pair of thick woolen socks." One can never have enough socks. It was a lie, and Harry knew it was a lie the way he knew the garlic was not for vampires, and he did not call it, because you do not call a man's lie about his heart's desire to his face in the dark, and because the lie told him more than the truth would have. A man who deflects the mirror with a joke about socks is a man who has looked into it and seen something he cannot bear to say aloud, something with people in it, Harry was certain, a room full of faces turned toward Albus Dumbledore, faces he had lost or failed or buried, a family the player had broken long ago and would give the world to stand among again. Harry looked at the old wizard beside him and revised, one last time, his whole model of Dumbledore, and the revision was the most useful thing he carried out of the room. Dumbledore was not a player who had forgotten how to want. He was a player who wanted, exactly as desperately as Harry did, the same impossible thing, to be known and forgiven and surrounded, and who had buried the want under a plan for the greater good the way Harry had buried his under a discipline, and who had told himself, the way Harry told himself, that the burying made him free. They were the same. That was the thing the mirror had shown Harry that Dumbledore would never know it had shown him. That the most dangerous man in the castle and the marked boy beside him were two versions of one creature, made by loneliness, ruled by a buried want, convinced of their own reasons, and that the only difference between them was 1,000 years and a door, and that Harry, who still felt the shame of running his friends, was the younger and the better of the two by exactly the width of a shame the elder of them had stopped feeling. He left the mirror that night with the cloak around him and a new fear he would not name, which was that he could see now the precise shape of what he might become, and it was sitting beside him on the floor talking about socks. Hermione cornered him in January, and the cornering was the crack he could not paper over, because Hermione Granger was the one person in the castle who collected evidence the way Harry collected it, and she had been collecting him. She did it in the library at the table in the back where they worked, with Ron sent off on an errand so that it would be only the two of them, and she did not lead up to it, because leading up to things was for people less certain than Hermione. "I've been keeping a list," she said, and put a folded piece of parchment on the table between them and did not unfold it. "I'm not going to show you, I just want you to know it exists and that I'm not stupid." She looked at him, and under the certainty was the old brittle fear, the fear of a girl about to be proven right and lose a friend for it, which was the worst way she knew to be right. The troll, that wasn't Leviosa. I've cast Leviosa 1,000 times, it doesn't tear a club out of a troll's hand. The match to needle, the first week, you did it wrong twice and then perfectly, like you were pretending to learn a thing you already knew. You never look at the board. You knew Flamel before I found him, I've thought about it, and you knew, you steered me, and on the broom. Her voice dropped. Everyone thinks you were nearly thrown. You weren't. I watched you. For about 2 seconds before you started fighting it, you weren't holding on at all and you weren't falling. You were just sitting on a broom that was trying to kill you, perfectly still, like it was nothing, and then you remembered to look frightened. I saw it. I'm not stupid, Harry. Harry sat in the library with the whole long autumn of his careful concealment laid on the table in a girl's level voice, and did the fastest arithmetic of his life, and the arithmetic came out somewhere he had not expected, which was that he was, for the first moment since the chamber, glad to be caught. He examined the gladness, because an unexamined feeling runs the house from the basement, and found that it was real and that it was dangerous and that he was going to follow it anyway. Here was the thing the mirror had shown him, the load-bearing want arrived in the flesh. A person who saw the real shape of him, not all of it, not the 1,000 years, but the fact of him, the hidden competence, the pretending, and who had not run, who had instead made a list and folded it and refused to show it and said, "I'm not stupid," which was the closest a frightened, brilliant 11-year-old could come to saying, "I see you and I'm still here." Every instinct the discipline owned said deny it. Deflect, give her the book alibi, point the true thing in a useful direction the way he pointed everything. He had the words ready, and he looked at Hermione Granger's level frightened certain face and discovered that he could not make himself say them, that 1,000 years of solitude had built a pressure behind the thick door that one brave list had cracked, and that the cost of keeping the door shut against her was, for the first time, higher than the cost of opening it an inch. So he opened it an inch. Not the chamber was not survivable as a told thing, and besides she would not have believed it, and besides it was not the part that mattered. He gave her the true part instead, the part under the facts, pointed for once at nothing but the truth. "You're not stupid," he said. "You're right about all of it. I'm not going to tell you how, not yet, maybe not ever, and I need you to be able to live with that, because it isn't mine to tell safely and people would get hurt me first. But I'm not going to lie to you about whether there's something to tell. There is. I've had to hide it my whole life. I'm very good at hiding it. And I'm so tired of every single person who likes me liking somebody I'm pretending to be." He had not planned the last sentence. It came up out of the cracked door on its own, the truest thing he had said aloud to a living person in 1,000 years, and it cost him, and he let it cost him, and watched it land on Hermione Granger like the thing she had actually been hunting all along, which was not the secret but the trust. She did not gasp or pry or unfold the list. She did the thing that made her worth the risk, which was to think about it seriously for a long quiet moment, and then to nod once, the nod of a person accepting terms, and to say, "All right, I don't need to know how. I just didn't want to be the only one who'd noticed and have you think I hadn't. It's lonely noticing things no one else does." And Harry, who had spent 1,000 years being the only one who noticed everything, looked at the one other person he had ever met who knew that particular loneliness, and felt the door at the end of the corridor open, not all the way, never all the way, but an inch and stay open, and did not, this once, reach to close it. Ron came back with the books and found them not talking in the particular way that means everything has changed, and being Ron, being the 6th of 7 and an expert in the weather of other people's silences, he did not ask, but he sat down close on Harry's other side, and the three of them made a shape in the back of the library that Harry recognized from the mirror, smaller, realer, two faces turned toward him that did not know the whole of what they were turned toward and stayed anyway. And he understood that this was as close as the living could come to the thing in the glass, and that it would have to be enough, and that it was, very nearly enough. He met the enemy in the flesh, or as near to flesh as it then had, on a detention in the forbidden forest in the spring, and the meeting told him more than a season of watching. There had been a foolish business with a dragon and a midnight tower, the kind of trouble children manufacture for themselves, and the price of it was a night in the forest with Hagrid, hunting the thing that had been killing unicorns. Harry had felt the wrongness of the wood from its edge. A deep old sickness laid over the deep old life of the place. and when the party split and the dark closed around him, he followed the wrongness to its source the way he followed everything, alone, into a moonlit clearing where a unicorn lay dead in silver white with its blood pooled bright as mercury on the black leaves, and a hooded figure crouched over the body with its face in the wound, drinking. The fold behind his scar did not prickle this time. It tore, the pain came up white and total, the worst it had been, worse than the feast, worse than the broom, because the thing in the clearing was not folded into a turban 3 rooms away but here, close, uncovered, the torn half-soul itself out of its host and feeding, and the 2 slivers of one enemy recognized each other across a clearing with a violence that drove Harry to one knee in the leaves. He let it drive him down. He did not fight the pain, because fighting it would have flared the mansion bright enough for the thing to feel, and instead he poured the agony into the parlor and held it there, a child's pain, loud and simple and concealing, while behind it the dark house took the measure of its enemy at last with nothing between them. It was pitiful, that was the discovery, and it was worth a knee in the cold leaves to make it. The thing drinking the unicorn's blood was the most feared name in modern Britain, reduced to a parasite in a borrowed cloak, too weak to hold a body of its own, kept alive between hosts by the silver blood of murdered innocence, which was the lowest magic there was, a half-life bought at the price of a curse on the drinker, because to slay something so pure for your own survival was to live cursed forever after. The enemy knew it and drank anyway, which told Harry the whole of its desperation. A thing that will take a cursed half-life over no life at all is a thing that has stopped weighing costs, a thing entirely committed to the stone, because the stone was the only thing that could lift it out of this crawling undeath and give it back a body that did not have to be stolen and starved. Harry knelt in the leaves and looked at his enemy's true face for the first time, and what he felt was not the fear the thing wanted and not the hate the story expected, but a flat, cold recognition, because he had seen this before in a different dark. He had seen what a creature becomes when it will pay any price to go on, when survival has eaten everything else it once was. The chamber had offered Harry that bargain on 1,000 gray mornings, the discipline that would keep him going by hollowing out the child, and he had refused it, one hand at a time, for 1,000 years. The thing in the clearing was what accepting it looked like. It was the hall, given a face, drinking blood in a wood. The hooded head came up, the mouth ran silver. And the thing fixed on Harry with the attention of a predator that has scented the one prey it has always wanted, and began to move toward him across the clearing, gliding, and the pain in the fold went past white into a place beyond color. And Harry, on his knee, made the same decision he kept making, to hold his fire, to stay hidden, to take the pain and give the enemy a stunned and stricken child rather than the thing that could have ended this crawling spirit in the leaves with a word, because ending it here, weak and bodiless, would only scatter it to wait again, and would announce to whatever watched that the marked boy was not what he seemed, and Harry intended the enemy to keep believing, all the way down to the last possible instant, that the child it had marked was only a child. So he knelt and he hurt and he waited, and he was rescued, as it happened, by the wood itself. A white centaur breaking into the clearing at a gallop, and the hooded thing fleeing the hooves, gone between the trees, and Harry let the centaur lift him and speak to him in riddles about the heavens, and answered as a frightened boy answers, and carried out of the forest the one fact that mattered, which was that his enemy had nothing left to lose and would come for the stone within days. And would come committed past all caution, and would have to be met not as the weak crawling thing in the clearing, but as whatever it became the moment it drank deep enough to stand. The enemy made his final preparations in the dark while the castle moved towards summer, and Harry tracked them the way he tracked everything, and the tracking told him the end was close. Quirrell was dying. Anyone with eyes could see Quirrell failing through the spring, grayer each week, thinner, the stammer worse in public, and Harry knew, gone entirely in private, and the castle read it as nerves or illness, and Harry read it as a host being eaten faster as the guest grew desperate, the torn half-soul draining its anchor dry in its hurry toward the stone, because a thing feeding in sips does not gray a man in a season, and a thing gulping does. The guest had given up on patience. It had tried the troll and the broom and failed, and now it was spending its host recklessly, which meant it had decided that the time for cleverness was past and the time for the direct attempt had come, and that it would make that attempt soon, while there was still enough of Quirrell left to walk. Harry had walked the road down already in his mind, because a man who has spent 1,000 years preparing does not arrive at a trapdoor unsurveyed. He had used the cloak through the spring to learn the third-floor corridor the way he learned everything fully, and he knew what waited behind the forbidden door. A vast three-headed dog standing over a trapdoor, a guardian out of the old bestiaries, fierce and ancient, and like most fierce ancient things, fitted with a single foolish lock, which was that it slept for music. He knew the trapdoor under its paws. He had not opened it. Opening it early would have tripped the player's trap before its time, and brought the whole machine down on a night of Dumbledore's choosing rather than Harry's. But he had read the seam of magic that ran down through the floor beneath the dog, the layered signatures of the teachers who had each set a trial below, Sprout's green-growing menace and Flitwick's charmwork and McGonagall's hard transfigured logic and Snape's cold riddling chemistry, and at the very bottom, deeper than the rest, the old grand grammar of the headmaster himself, wrapped around the stone like a fist. He had mapped the descent without taking a step of it. So when the night came, Harry would not be going down into the unknown the way the player believed every child went down into the unknown. He would be going down a stair he had already counted, toward a door he had already read, to meet a thing whose desperation he had already measured in a wood, and the only variable left on the whole board was the one the player had failed to account for, which was Harry himself. And then on a morning in June, the last piece moved, and it was the player's piece, and it told Harry the trap was about to spring. Dumbledore was called away. An urgent summons from the ministry, the whole school buzzing with it, the headmaster gone on the very week the enemy was clearly cornered and desperate, and Harry stood in the entrance hall and watched the most powerful wizard in Britain leave his castle undefended at the precise moment a starving guest in a turban would dare the third-floor door, and understood the move for exactly what it was, because he had built traps himself in the chamber against the echoes. It was not a coincidence and it was not a mistake, it was bait. Dumbledore had not been fooled by a fake ministry summons. Dumbledore had allowed it, had left on purpose, had pulled the most powerful piece off the board to convince the enemy the way was finally clear, so that the thing in the turban would commit to the trap tonight, would go down through the trials the player had built, where it could be dealt with on Dumbledore's terms. The whole year had been bending toward this. The forbidden door, the announced danger, the cloak, the mirror, the curated dangers fed to Mark Boy all autumn. Every piece of it had been the player drawing the enemy toward one night on ground of his choosing, and the player had left visibly, publicly, to fire the trap. There was only one thing the player had got wrong, and Harry stood in the emptying entrance hall and felt the whole position resolve around it. Dumbledore's trap was built to catch the enemy. It was not built to account for the children. The trials below were lethal, and the enemy was desperate, and the headmaster who had arranged it all was 100 miles away trusting his own machine. And somewhere in the castle a starving thing was about to go down a hole that a brilliant girl had already half solved, and a brave boy would follow her into, because that was who they were, and Harry knew with a cold completeness that if he did nothing, if he let the trap work, if he stayed the watcher hidden among the watched and let the player's beautiful machine grind the enemy down on schedule, there was a real and calculable chance that the machine would grind his friends as well, and that Albus Dumbledore, who wanted the same impossible thing Harry wanted and had buried it under a plan, had built a plan with a margin in it that he was willing to spend, and that the margin had freckles and a list folded in her pocket, and faces Harry had seen once in a mirror. Turned toward him and staying, they tried the adults first, because Hermione insisted on it and because Harry let her, knowing exactly how it would go and needing the three of them to have tried, so that what came after would be a thing they had been forced to rather than a thing they had chosen out of recklessness. They found Professor McGonagall in a corridor with an armful of papers, and Hermione laid it out, the stone, the danger, the certainty that someone would try for it tonight while the headmaster was gone, and McGonagall looked at 3 first-years telling her how to mine the most heavily defended object in Britain and did precisely what a sensible deputy headmistress does, which was to be brisk and kind and entirely immovable. "The stone is well protected," she said. "It is guarded by spells set by the finest witches and wizards of this castle, and I assure you, Miss Granger, that no one is going to steal it tonight or any night. How you three even came to hear of it I cannot imagine, but you will put it out of your heads. Go back to your common room." And she swept off with her papers, certain, the way they were all certain, the way the whole castle was certain, that the machine the headmaster had built would hold, and Harry watched her go and felt the last door of the ordinary world close gently in his face. He had known it would. He could have stopped her in the corridor with a sentence, could have spoken to her in a register that would have turned her around and emptied the castle of teachers and ended the night before it began. He did not, and the not doing was the whole of the trap he had built for himself, because to compel a teacher with a word no first-year could speak was to reveal the mansion to the entire staff, and Harry had decided long ago that there was exactly one person he would unveil himself to tonight, and it was waiting at the bottom of the trapdoor, not standing in a corridor with an armful of marking. "She won't help," Hermione said, white, when McGonagall had gone. "Nobody will. They all think it's safe because Dumbledore said so. Dumbledore said so because Dumbledore wants someone to come for it," Harry said, before he could stop himself, and watched both of them look at him, and knew he had let another inch of the truth out and let it stay out because the time for inches was nearly over. He left on purpose. The stone's the bait. The whole thing's a trap, and it's a good one, and it was built to catch a grown dark wizard, not to keep 3 of us out of it, which means the people most likely to get hurt walking into it tonight aren't the enemy, they're us. He looked at the 2 faces from the mirror. And the one man who could fix that is 100 miles away trusting his own machine. So it's us, or it's no one, and no one means the enemy gets a stone that brings the dead back to life. I've done the arithmetic about 40 times since dinner. It always comes out the same. He went to find them and they were already looking for him, which was how he knew the night had truly come, and Hermione's face was white and certain, and Ron was a step behind her wearing the grim chessboard look that came over him when he had seen 3 moves ahead and did not like any of them. "Snape," Hermione said, "it has to be tonight. Dumbledore's gone, someone has to," and Harry let her have the wrong name, because the wrong name did not matter now, and looked at the two of them, the two faces from the glass, and made the largest decision he had made since a hearthstone floated up for his hand 1,000 years and 1 winter ago. The discipline had its case ready, and the case was flawless. Go alone. Go under the cloak unseen and reach the stone first, and deal with the enemy in the dark with no witnesses, and keep the mansion shuttered and the 1,000 years secret and the 2 children safe in the tower by the simple expedient of stunning them both where they stood and going down without them. It was the correct move. It was the move that cost the least and revealed the least and protected the most, and Harry had made the correct move every day of his long life on a cold floor on 400 stairs against the braided 7, in a parlor lit for a probing headmaster, and the correct move had kept him alive and kept him hidden and kept him, every single morning, alone. He looked at his friends. And he made instead the other move, the one the cartographer had said the lasting ones all made, the one that had nothing to do with arithmetic, because a person is not a thing you are but a thing you do, every morning 1 hand at a time, and the hand he moved now did not reach for his wand to stun them. It reached out open to bring them with him. "It's not Snape," Harry said. "I'll explain on the way. And you're not going to like how much I already know, and you're going to ask me how, and I'm not going to be able to answer all of it tonight. But I'm not going down there without you, and I'm not letting you go down there without me. And after tonight, there's going to be a great deal you've seen that I can't take back, and I need you to decide, right now, both of you, whether you want to walk down a trapdoor with someone you've only half figured out." He held out his hand, and it did not tremble because he had worn the tremble out 1,000 years ago, and he understood that he was about to break the discipline of a lifetime in front of the only 2 people whose opinion of him he could not survive losing, and that this was the crack the whole year had been bending toward, not a slip but a choice, and that he was choosing it. "I've been alone a very long time," he said. "Longer than you'd believe. I'd rather not do this part alone, too." Hermione took his hand. Ron took his other one and said, "Mate, we were always coming. You're just the only one who needed a speech about it." And the 3 of them turned toward the 3rd-floor corridor and the forbidden door and the trapdoor under it, and the long dark trial the player had built, and the starving thing already moving through it toward a stone that made the dead undie, and Harry Potter, 1,000 years deep and 11 years old and no longer, for this one night alone, went down to meet the end of the gambit on his own terms at last. Chapter 6 and Chapter 7. The measure of 1,000 years, the 3-headed dog slept for music, and Harry had brought music, and that was the first and smallest of the night's reframings, because everyone else who came to that door would have to gamble on a flute and a melody, and Harry had spent 40 years of subjective time learning what notes a guardian out of the old bestiaries was bound to answer to, and so the great beast went down into its dreaming the moment the sound reached it, 3 vast heads sinking onto 3 vast paws. And the trapdoor lay open under them like an invitation 1,000 years in the making. It was not lost on Harry, standing at the lip of the open trapdoor with 2 friends at his shoulder, that he had done this before, a hole in the floor of the world, a dark that breathed up at him, a choice to go down into it alone or this once not alone. He had stood at the head of 400 stairs 1,000 years ago and run the most important calculation of his life and gone down into the silver dark and come out a millennium deep. And now he stood at the head of another descent into another made dark, toward another made thing humming with old grammar, and the symmetry of it was so complete that he let himself, for the length of one breath, feel the size of his own strange life. The life of a person who kept falling through floors into chambers no one else could find. Then he set the feeling down because feelings were for after and stepped off the edge into the breathing dark, and this time 2 people he had decided to love stepped off the edge after him, which was the only thing about the descent that was new and the only thing that mattered. He went first into the dark, and Ron and Hermione came after, and the fall ended on something soft that was not soft for long. Devil's Snare, the deep green strangling vine that fed on struggle, and it had them around the ankles and the wrists before they had stopped rolling, and this was Hermione's, and Harry made it Hermione's on purpose because he had decided on the way down that the trials below were not only obstacles but gifts, the last chance any of them might have to be, for a moment, the best in the room at a thing that mattered, and he was not going to take that from his friends merely because he could. So he let the vine take him and went still in its grip, the stillness the chamber had taught him, and watched Hermione's mind do the thing it was built for, watched her name the plant and remember the lesson and call fire out of her wand to drive it shrieking back into the dark, and he let her save them and saw what it did to her to have saved them, the brittle armor of being unanswerable turning, for one bright second, into the simple clean pride of a girl who had been right when it counted. And he counted the cost of his restraint and found it the best money he had spent all year. The next chamber was keys, a swarm of small winged keys glittering against a high ceiling, and a single old broom and a locked door, and this one the knight gave to Harry, because there was no one else it could give it to, and because a seeker catching a key out of a swarm was the one impossible thing Harry could do in front of witnesses with a ready name on it. He took the broom and went up into the storm of wings, and he did not hunt the key the slow way. He had read the lock from the floor, the shape of the ward, the single old silver key with the bent wing that fit it, and he went through the swarm and took it out of the air on the first pass with 1,000 years of precision, wearing the borrowed coat of a flyer's gift, and dropped to the door and opened it, and Ron said, "Blimey, you're good," and Harry let himself be good, because good was a word the world had a shelf for, and the shelf was holding. Then chess, and chess was Ron's, and chess was the hardest of the gifts to give, because giving it cost more than restraint. It cost watching a friend choose to be hurt. The chamber was a great board with pieces tall as horsemen, and the only way across was to play and to win, and Ron saw it in a glance, saw the whole brutal geometry of it the way Hermione saw a plant and Harry saw a ward, because this was the thing Ron Weasley was the best in the world at among the three of them, and he took command of it with a confidence Harry had never seen him wear in a classroom. Harry could have solved the board. He had played the echoes of dead grandmasters in the chamber. A transfigured chess set held no terror for a man who had lost 10,000 games to learn to win them. He kept silent. He took the square Ron assigned him and moved when Ron moved him, and watched his friend read the position toward its only solution, which was that the one directing the game would have to let himself be taken, would have to walk a knight into a sacrifice so that the way across could open, and Harry understood the solution 3 moves before Ron spoke it, and understood also that he must not speak it first. Because this was Ron's board and Ron's brilliance and Ron's one chance in his whole overlooked 6th of 7 life to be the one who mattered most in the room, and to take that from him, to spare him a wound, would be to tell him forever that he had never really been needed. "It's the only way," Ron said, pale, looking at the White Queen. "I've got to be taken." Everything in Harry wanted to override it. The discipline for once was on the side of love, and they were both wrong, and he knew they were both wrong, and he let Ron make the move. He let his friend walk the knight forward and be smashed from the saddle by the White Queen and flung across the stone, and he held himself still in his square while Hermione screamed, because moving early would lose the game and reveal the mansion both, and because Ron had chosen this, had earned this, had bought their way across the board with the one currency that was wholly his, and the truest respect Harry could pay him was to let the purchase stand. The way opened. Ron lay still and breathing at the edge of the board, and Harry crossed to him and knelt and confirmed with one touch what the time arts told him already, that the skull was cracked but the life was sound, that his friend would wake, and he told Hermione so in a voice she believed because it was true, and the two of them pressed on together into the dark, leaving Ron breathing where he lay, because the stone would not wait, and a friend who was breathing was a friend you could come back for. The next room stopped them at a long table, because the instant they crossed its threshold flames roared up in the doorway ahead of them, black flame, and in the doorway behind them, purple, sealing the two of them between like a held breath, and on the table stood a line of 7 bottles of different shapes and sizes and a roll of parchment. Harry read the black fire from where he stood and knew it for Snape's work, cold and exact and without an ounce of waste, a barrier that was also a riddle. One of the 7 bottles would carry a single drinker safely forward through the black flame, one would carry a single drinker back through the purple, 2 held only nettle wine and 3 held poison, and the parchment set out in a verse of clues, the logic that told them apart, a puzzle that rewarded the patient and killed the hasty. This was Snape's, and of all the trials it was the most purely a test of the one discipline the wizarding world chronically lacked, which was the willingness to stand in front of a row of bottles with death in 5 of them and think instead of drink. Harry could have named the right bottle from the doorway. The logic was a child's exercise where he came from, and the grammar of the flames told him which was which before he had read a line of the verse. He looked at Hermione instead. Logic laid out on parchment was the truest country she owned. The one place her armor and herself were the same thing, and the sameness was a strength rather than a wound, and he watched her bend over the riddle with the black flame lighting her face and work it through line by patient line, and arrive, certain, glowing, correct, at the smallest bottle in the row, and at the rounded one that would carry a drinker back. She had solved it, and she believed she had solved it alone, and the believing was the gift, and Harry took it from her the way he took nothing else in his life, which was by keeping his mouth shut and letting it stand. There was one swallow of the black potion and no more, enough to carry a single person forward and no second, and the smallness of the bottle settled the thing Harry had already half settled in the chess room. He made the next decision of the night then, which was to send Hermione back. "Stay with him," Harry said. "He's going to wake up frightened and alone in the dark under school, and that's worse than what's ahead of me. I need someone he trusts to be here when his eyes open." It was true, and it was also the kindest lie he had ever engineered, because the thing ahead of him was a thing no one could be allowed to witness, and he had found, in a cracked skull and a screaming girl, the one argument that would make Hermione Granger leave a fight, which was a friend who needed her more than the fight did. She looked at him and the data frown came over her, the old one, the one that knew something did not fit, because brave, reckless Harry was sending her to safety with the calm of a general and not the fear of a boy. "Harry," she said, "whatever you are, come back." And she did not ask the question, because she had agreed in a library not to, and she went to Ron, and Harry went on alone toward the last door, carrying the one thing she had given him that was worth more than the answer she had not demanded, which was the knowing that someone was waiting for him to come back. The last chamber held a fire that was not for burning in the mirror of Arist and Professor Quirrell, and Quirrell turned from the glass with no stammer left in him at all. "Potter," he said, and the voice was smooth and cold and entirely unfamiliar, the voice of a man who had set down a costume he had worn for a year. "I wondered whether it would be you, not Severus. You, the famous, modest, lucky Potter boy, come down through Albus's little trials with 2 friends and a great deal of nerve. How tiresome, how exactly what he would have arranged." He looked Harry over with the contempt the parlor had been fed all year. "He has been grooming you for this since September, you understand, the forbidden door, the cloak. He left you breadcrumbs all the way to this room and called it your choice. You are a piece, Potter, you always were. The only question that interested me was whose." Harry stood in the firelit dark and let the enemy talk, because a talking enemy is an enemy teaching you the shape of his certainty for free, and because he was doing one last sum, the largest of his life, and he needed the seconds. The sum was this: from the moment he spoke in his true voice, the concealment of 1,000 years was over for the one being in the room, and that being would either die here or escape, and if it escaped it would carry the knowledge out into the world. He weighed it. He weighed the cost of revealing himself to Lord Voldemort against the cost of letting Lord Voldemort take a stone that undied the dead, and the sum came out the way it had come out 40 times since dinner, clean and simple and irreversible, and Harry made his peace with the price the way he had made his peace with 1,000 years on a cold floor, fully, without flinching, and prepared to spend the secret he had guarded since the chamber. "Get the stone for me," Quirrell said, and turned him toward the mirror, and a voice that did not come from Quirrell's mouth, a voice like cold wind over stone, hissed from somewhere behind the turban, "Use the child." The mirror puzzle Harry solved in the time it took to look at it, because he could read the grammar of the thing the way he read everything, and the grammar was Dumbledore's, and it was, Harry thought with something that on a less disciplined creature would have been admiration, rather beautiful. The headmaster had hidden the stone inside the wand. The mirror that showed the heart's desire had been made the stone's last vault, enchanted so that it would yield the stone only to a person who looked into it, and desired to find the stone and not to use it, who wanted possession without wanting power, which was a test no greedy man could pass and no frightened man could pass, and Dumbledore had surely believed no living wizard could pass cleanly, because every living wizard wanted somewhere to use the thing that conquered death. Voldemort would stand before the glass and see himself holding the stone and using it, and would never, therefore, be given it. It was a lock that opened only to a heart that did not fear death and did not crave it, an empty-handed heart, and Dumbledore had built it certain that no such heart existed. He had not accounted for the one creature in the world who had died 10,000 times at a chalk line and learned, across 1,000 years, to want nothing the mirror could show him. Harry looked into the glass. He did not let the enemy see his face do the thing it did. The mirror reached into him for his heart's desire, the way it had in the disused classroom, and found the room full of faces turned toward him, the load-bearing want, and then it reached past even that, because Harry had come here wanting one thing more than to be known, wanting it cleanly and entirely and without a grain of greed, which was to keep the stone out of the hands of the thing behind the turban, to find it and never use it. To take Death's master and lock it away and walk on as he had always walked, unafraid of dying and uninterested in escaping it. The mirror weighed his heart and found it empty of the one hunger the lock was set against, and a weight dropped into Harry's pocket, cold and small and heavier than its size, and he understood that he had just passed alone the test the most powerful wizard in Britain had built to be unpassable, and that the passing was the truest measure of the 1,000 years, because the chamber had not made him strong enough to take the stone. It had made him empty enough. "Well," hissed the cold voice, "what do you see?" And Harry Potter, 11 years old and 1,000 years deep, with the philosopher's stone in his pocket and his friends safe behind him in the dark, and his enemy's whole attention finally, fatally, fixed on him, stopped pretending. He let the mansion open. Not the parlor, the mansion, the whole vast dark 1,000-year house behind the child's face, and he let it show in his eyes and his stillness and his voice, and he watched the most feared wizard of the age realize in the space of one breath that the room had changed. "I see," Harry said, and the voice that came out of him was not a boy's, was nothing a boy could counterfeit, was old and level and entirely without fear, a thing that drank a unicorn's blood in a wood because it could not bear to stop existing. "I see what a person becomes when survival eats everything else he was. I have seen it before. I was offered the same bargain once for 1,000 years on 1,000 gray mornings, and I want you to understand before this ends that the only difference between us is that I said no." The turban came off. Quirrell unwound it with shaking hands and turned, and on the back of his skull was a face. A terrible, flat, snake-nostriled face with red eyes, the torn half-soul wearing the back of its host's head, and it looked at Harry with those red eyes and did the thing Harry had been waiting 1 year and 1,000 years to make it do, which was to truly look, to bring the full attention of Lord Voldemort to bear on the child he had marked, and to find at last, behind the scar in the parlor, in the famous lucky modest boy. The thing that had been standing in the dark the whole time. "What are you?" the red-eyed face breathed, and there was, in the most feared voice in Britain, a note Harry had never expected to hear in it, the note of a thing encountering, for the first time in 50 years, something it did not understand and could not measure and had reason to fear. "I'm what you would have given anything to be," Harry said, "and never could because you were always too afraid of dying to do the one thing that makes a person more than a hunger. I stopped being afraid. It took me 1,000 years. You've had 50 and you spent every one of them running from the dark instead of walking into it, and that is why you are a face on the back of a borrowed head, and I am a child who is not afraid of you. Kill me," and Harry spread his empty hands and meant it, and the meaning was the most terrifying weapon in the room. "You can't, not because of a prophecy, because I have already done it more times than you have years, and there is nothing left in it for you to threaten me with." Voldemort screamed at Quirrell to seize him, and Quirrell lunged, and the ascension Harry had folded down for 1,000 years came up at last out of the dark like a tide coming in. He did not shout a spell. He had set down spells 400 years into the long night. Spells were the brutal abbreviation, the lean on the wall, and Harry did not lean now. He spoke instead in the old tongue, the deep grammar magic used to speak to itself before any wizard dressed it up in Latin, and the firelit chamber answered him the way the chamber under the sea had answered him, the way the castle answered him, the way everything old enough to be honest answered him, because he was speaking to the world in its own first language, and the world cannot refuse its own first language. The knot fire on the doorways roared up into a wall. The stone of the floor remembered, under his word, that it had once been the bottom of a sea, and ran like water around Quirrell's feet. The air itself clenched into a fist around Quirrell as he lunged, and Harry stood in the center of a room rearranging itself to his sentences and let Lord Voldemort see, for the few seconds the seeing would cost, exactly what 1,000 years of discipline poured through a focus of holly and phoenix feather looked like when it stopped pretending to be a schoolboy's luck. There is a register the world keeps for the speech of very old and very honest things, and Harry had learned it on the highest ring of a hall under the sea, and he spoke it now into a chamber under a school, and the chamber listened the way a congregation listens. He had spent 1,000 years learning that power was not a quantity you threw but a sentence you composed, that the wizards above leaned on 3 words and called it mastery, and that true magic was a conversation conducted with a universe that had never once been addressed politely by a frightened man with a stick. He addressed it politely. He asked the fire to be a wall, and it was glad, after 1,000 years of being asked to merely burn, to be asked at last to mean something. He reminded the floor of the sea it had been, and it remembered with the relief of an old creature permitted to be young. He did not raise his voice, because the things that answered him were too old and too vast to be shouted at, and the not shouting was itself the most frightening thing in the room. A child standing calm in a storm he was conducting like an orchestra, every element of the chamber bending toward him not in terror but in a kind of recognition, the way the carved stairs had bent, the way the bell had held its note, the way the whole castle had decided on the boats that the small ancient thing belonged to it. Lord Voldemort had spent 50 years taking from the world by force, tearing what he wanted out of it with curses, and the world had given him exactly what force earns, which is a half-life on the back of a borrowed head. Harry asked, and the world, which had been waiting 1,000 years for someone to ask, gave him everything. It was not a duel. A duel is a thing between equals, and there were no equals in the room. It was a demonstration, terrible and brief and almost gentle in its certainty. A child unmaking the careful traps of a dark lord with the bored precision of a man stepping over furniture in his own house. And Quirrell, driven by the screaming thing on the back of his skull, threw curse after curse, the green and the red and the unforgivable, and Harry let none of them land and answered none of them with death. Because he had learned against the braided 7 that you do not parry a thing built to defeat a defense, you step inside it, and he stepped inside everything Voldemort had, inside 50 years of accumulated malice, and stood at the center of it untouched, and reached out one empty hand, and laid it against Quirrell's face. And that was the last reframing, and the deepest, and the one Harry had not earned, and could not have earned in 1,000 years, because the thing that happened when his skin met Quirrell's was not his doing at all. Quirrell screamed, and where Harry touched him his flesh blistered and burned and crumbled to ash, and Harry felt the magic that did it pour out of his own skin without his command, an old deep working laid into him before he could remember, before the cupboard, before everything, a word written not in the old tongue he had spent a millennium mastering, but in a language older than any shelf in the chamber, the language his mother had spoken with her body on a night Harry could not recall. When she had stood between an infant and a killing curse and chosen freely to die instead, and had left the choice burned into her son's skin like a sigil, Lily's protection, the love that had marked him before the enemy did. Harry had walked out of 1,000 years of self-made power believing he had become unbeatable by his own hand, and he stood now in a burning chamber and felt the truth of it humble the whole millennium, because the magic that destroyed Lord Voldemort's body was the one magic Harry had not learned, could not learn, had simply been given before he was old enough to count anything, by a woman who had loved him enough to become a wall. The 1,000 years had made him empty enough to take the stone. His mother had made him safe enough to survive the taking, and Harry understood, with Quirrell crumbling to ash under his hand and the red-eyed face tearing loose from the ruin, that the door he had kept against 1,000 years, the want to be counted, to be known, to be loved, and to remain, was not a weakness the discipline had failed to drill out of him. It was the same magic. It was love kept burning behind a thick door, the oldest and deepest working there was, and it had been protecting him the whole time, from the curse and from the cupboard and from the chamber and from himself. The thing that had been Voldemort tore free of the collapsing body as a ribbon of black smoke, screaming, and Harry let it go. He could have ended it. He stood in a room he had remade with his voice, with the stone in his pocket and the protection blazing in his skin, and the torn half-soul fled past him toward the dark of the doorway, weak enough to be unmade with a word, and Harry did not say the word, and the not saying was the last and coldest calculation of the night. A spirit driven from a body did not die. He had read enough of the worst shelves in the chamber to know what a thing like this had done to keep itself anchored to the world, the splitting, the vessels, the ruined magic of a soul torn into pieces and hidden, and he knew that the smoke fleeing past him was one fragment of a thing scattered across the world, and that killing this fragment would gain nothing but the loss of the one tether by which he might one day find the rest. So he let it flee. He let Lord Voldemort escape into the dark, carrying the one piece of knowledge Harry had spent his whole secret to give him, which was that the child he had marked was a thing 1,000 years deep, unafraid and unmatched, and would be waiting, with all the time in the world, whenever the rest of him crawled back. It was a gift and a sentence both. Let the enemy spend his long return knowing exactly what waited at the end of it. Let him be the one, for a change, who could not stop seeing the size of the thing in the room. Then the strength went out of Harry, because even a 1,000-year-old mind sits in an 11-year-old body, and the body had poured out more in 5 minutes than it had ever been built to hold. And the last thing Harry saw before the firelit chamber tilted and went dark was the stone glowing faintly through the cloth of his pocket, secured, and the last thing he thought was that he had come down a trapdoor alone and was not, after all, going to die alone. Because someone was waiting in the dark above for him to come back, he woke in white. The hospital wing, sun through high windows, the particular clean quiet of a place built for mending, and beside the bed, asleep in a hard chair with a book open on his chest, was the player, and Harry lay still and watched Albus Dumbledore sleep, and did the morning's first arithmetic before the old wizard's eyes had opened. Dumbledore woke and saw him awake, and the blue eyes behind the half-moon glasses were warm and tired, and underneath, working harder than Harry had ever felt them work, and Harry understood that the reckoning had come, that the player had stood in a burned chamber and read the evidence and built his explanation, and that the next conversation would decide how much of the 1,000 years the most dangerous man in Britain got to keep. "You destroyed Professor Quirrell," Dumbledore said gently, "or rather, the thing that was using him destroyed itself trying to take what your mother's protection would not let it take. Quirrell could not touch you, Harry. The charm Lily left in your skin saw to that. It is an old magic and a deep one, and Voldemort in his arrogance forgot it, as he forgets all the magics he considers beneath him. You are very lucky to be alive." He said it kindly, and he watched, the way he always watched, and Harry saw the whole of the explanation the player had built, and saw that it was sound, and saw that Dumbledore wanted very badly for it to be the whole truth, because the whole truth was a comfortable one. A marked boy saved a second time by a dead mother's love, a hero in the making, a piece performing exactly as the gambit required. But under the comfortable explanation the blue eyes were working, because Albus Dumbledore had not survived a century of his own cleverness by believing comfortable things all the way down, and there were facts in that chamber the protection did not cover. A mirror that had yielded the stone to no one but Harry. A room rearranged by a magic that left no one signature any teacher could name. A Dark Lord's spirit driven out and let flee. And a boy who lay in a hospital bed and looked back at the most penetrating gaze in the wizarding world with a calm that no 11-year-old who had nearly died in the dark had any business owning. Harry felt the soft, inquiring pressure come at the front of his mind, harder than at the feast, harder than in the office, the player throwing everything he had at the parlor door, and Harry made the last decision of the long year, which was the same decision he had made all year, to hold the door, and to give the player exactly one true thing through the gap, because 1,000 years had taught him that you defeat a man certain of his own sight not by blinding him, but by letting him see a truth that serves you. I wasn't lucky, sir, Harry said quietly, and let a single inch of the mansion show in his eyes, just an inch, the way he had let the holly wand taste an inch of him in Ollivander's shop, enough to be felt and not enough to be named. I want you to know that between us, because I think you've guessed it, and I'd rather you guessed it from me. I'm not what the story says I am. I'm not sure I ever was. I don't know how much of that you can see, and I'm not going to tell you the rest, because it isn't safe yet for me or for anyone, and because you of all people know what it is to carry a thing you can't put down. He held the old wizard's gaze and let the inch stay open between them, one buried creature to another, the mirror's twins. You buried something too. I saw it in the glass the night you found me. You don't see socks. We both want the same impossible thing, you and I, and we've both built a whole life out of pretending we don't, and the only difference is that you've had 100 years to forget your pretending, and I've still got the shame of it. I'd like to keep the shame, sir. I think it's the only thing keeping me from becoming you. It was the most dangerous thing Harry had said to anyone since he came up the stairs, and he said it on purpose, because the player could not be lied to all the way down, and the next best move against a man like that was to hand him a truth so large and so intimate that he stopped looking for the ones behind it. He watched it land. He watched Albus Dumbledore receive, from an 11-year-old in a hospital bed, the most accurate account of his own heart that anyone had given him in 50 years. And he watched the old wizard understand that the Potter boy was something he had not planned for and could not measure, and would now have to live alongside without ever being permitted to see the bottom of, and he watched under the working blue eyes. Something that was not quite alarm and not quite grief and not quite respect, but stood where all three would stand, settle over the most dangerous man in Britain, the settling of a player who has just discovered, very late in a long game, that there is another mind at the board. The stone, Dumbledore said, and there it was, the real question under the kind ones, laid down at last with a craftsman's gentleness. It was hidden where only one who wished to find it and not to use it could reach it. A protection I was rather proud of. I confess I did not expect it to be solved by a first year, and I have been sitting here some hours, Harry, wondering what manner of 11-year-old heart could stand before the mirror of Arist with the conqueror of death within reach and want nothing the glass could offer him. It is not a common emptiness. I have met it perhaps twice in a long life, and both times it frightened me. Harry felt the whole weight of the inquiry behind the mild words, the player turning over the single fact his comfortable explanation could not cover, and he gave him again a truth pointed in a useful direction, because it was the only move that worked on a man who could not be lied to all the way down. I've never been afraid of dying, sir, he said, which was true to the marrow and explained nothing and everything. I'm not sure I know why. The cupboard, maybe. When you grow up certain you're not wanted, the worst thing the world can threaten you with stops being the worst thing very early. He let the sentence sit, a sad, ordinary trauma laid over 1,000 years, the same misdirection that had served him all year, true in every word and false in every implication. I didn't want the stone. I wanted you to still have built the trap for nothing rather than have him hold it. That's all the mirror saw. And Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment, and Harry watched him decide, the way the master always decided, to accept the truth that was offered because chasing the one behind it would cost more than it was worth, and to file the wrongness close at hand against a later year. I think, Dumbledore said at last slowly, and the twinkle when it came was real and rueful and a little afraid, that I have made a number of assumptions about you, Harry Potter, that I shall now have to spend a great while unmaking. And I think you intend to let me unmake them at exactly the pace that suits you and no faster. He almost smiled. Your mother would have liked you enormously. She was the only other person who ever made me feel I had been read rather than heard. He rose and gathered his book and paused at the foot of the bed, and the steel came up one last time under the warmth, gentle and total. The world is going to want a great deal from the hero in the story in the years to come. He will return, you understand, not soon, but he will, and when he does, the story will want its hero. I wonder which of you it will get. Both, Harry said. That's the whole trick, sir. You should know. You've been doing it for 100 years. And Albus Dumbledore inclined his head, the small, precise nod of a player acknowledging a piece that has revealed itself to be an opponent, and went out, and Harry lay back in the white quiet and let the front room face come off entirely, because there was no one left in the room to perform for, and was, for a while, simply ancient and simply tired and simply, against every odd 1,000 years had taught him to expect, not alone. He had destroyed the stone himself in the small hours before the strength came back to his legs, with a working in the old tongue that unmade the thing as gently as it had been made, because a world with an object that conquered death in it was a world built around a wound, and Harry had spent 1,000 years learning that the kindest thing you can do with certain kinds of power is to set them down where no one will ever pick them up. He had arranged the unmaking so that the evidence pointed to Dumbledore's own hand, a final small concealment laid over a year of them, and the player would tell the world in time that he and Nicholas Flamel had agreed the stone must be destroyed, and the world would believe it because the world believed Dumbledore, and that was exactly the use Harry had for the world believing Dumbledore. He felt no triumph about it. Triumph was a feeling for people who had been in doubt. He felt instead the flat, clean rightness of a sum that had finally balanced, the first one of the whole long year that had. They came that afternoon, Ron with his head bandaged and his grin intact, Hermione with a list she would never unfold and a fierce wet-eyed relief she did not bother to hide, and they sat on the end of his bed and argued about chess and ate the sweets piled on the table and treated him gloriously like a boy, like a friend, like the third point of a shape they had made in the back of a library and carried down a trapdoor and brought back up into the light. They did not ask him how. Hermione had promised, and Ron had decided in his own wordless way, that whatever Harry was, he was theirs, and the two of them filled the white room with the loud, ordinary noise of people who had survived a thing together, and Harry lay in the middle of it and let it wash over the 1,000 years like the smell of green growing things out of a herbarium on the 400th ring. He had walked into a chamber where one night lasted 1,000 years, and he had walked out unbeatable, and he had spent the whole long autumn and winter and spring learning the one thing the chamber could not teach him, which was that unbeatable was not the same as unalone, and that all the discipline in the world could make a person impossible to defeat and still leave him impossible to reach. The stone was destroyed. He had seen to that himself the night before in a way Dumbledore believed was Dumbledore's doing. The enemy was scattered and fled and would, one far day, return, knowing now exactly what waited for him. The player would watch Harry for the rest of his clever, careful life and never see the bottom. And none of it, Harry thought, listening to Ron lose an argument he had already lost twice, was the thing that had changed him most. The thing that had changed him most was a girl who had said come back, and a boy who had said you're just the only one who needed a speech, and a door at the end of a long corridor that he had kept shut against 1,000 years, and had finally, this year, in a castle his own age, begun to leave open. He was 11 years old in every inch a careless eye could measure, and 1,000 years deep where no eye could reach, and for the first time since a hearthstone had closed over his head into the silver dark, he was both of those things at once and not hiding either, not from the two people who mattered, and that in the end was the measure of the 1,000 years, not what they had made him strong enough to do, but what they had made him brave enough at last to let himself want. Chapter 7 end.